Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. How's everyone doing? Alhamdulillah. Awake? Inshallah. Let's begin. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma akhrijna min dhulumati al-wahm wa akrimna bi nuri al-fahm وافتح علينا بمعرفة العلم وحسن أخلاقنا بالحلم وجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this endeavor of 2 days. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open our hearts and our minds to understand and to absorb anything that is beneficial that is going to be shared in these 2 days, inshallah ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to remove the obstacles, to remove the hurdles, to facilitate and to help us purify our intentions for being here. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna ilma. Everybody should be on the WhatsApp group. Anybody not on the WhatsApp group? Couple of people not on the WhatsApp group. Okay. Are you registered? Saad and Sister Salma? Right? Okay. So you just joined the WhatsApp group or not yet? Okay. So Sister Sharmeen can help both of you, inshallah, join the WhatsApp group. As long as you are registered, you should be able to join. Anybody on Zoom who is not on the WhatsApp group, please just send a message and inshallah we will try to help you out. I have already shared some messages on the WhatsApp group. Among the messages that I have shared is the schedule for today and tomorrow. That is also on the course webpage. So the first session, which starts at 9:30, which is this current session, this is going to go until 10:45, inshallah. At 10:45, we are going to take our first break. And that break is going to be about 15 minutes long. That's going to be a time when you can get some coffee from the back or get some water, use the restroom, or just, review your notes, maybe write down some questions. I'll talk about how we're going to do Q&A in just a minute, inshallah ta'ala. And then we will resume after that and continue, inshallah. So I'm going to request Sister Sharmeen and the rest of you as well to keep me on time. So 10:45 is when we're supposed to take our break. If you see that, 10:45, we've hit the time and I'm still talking, just raise your hand and remind me that it's 10:45, inshallah ta'ala. And then, if I need to keep going for another 5 minutes, I'll tell you, but hopefully we'll try to stay as punctual as possible. There is a lot of material that needs to be covered in this class. Believe it or not, this class used to be 3 separate courses. 3 separate courses, and they've been combined and shrunk into one course, and the course is being taught as a weekend seminar instead of a weekly class. So a lot of packing has been done in this seminar, which is good and bad. It's good because instead of, learning this material over the course of a year, you're learning it over the course of a weekend. And so a lot of material has also been removed that I felt was too advanced or unnecessary. But the con here is that there's just a lot of material. And that makes this course, in my estimation, Allahu Alam, in my estimation, this is the most difficult course of the entire Marifa program. I'm just going to let you know right now. I'm not trying to scare you, okay? I want you to have the right expectation here, okay? So be prepared to be confused, be prepared to find things challenging. However, because the material is so much, I have to be really careful about making sure that I don't slow down. Otherwise, we will not finish the material, okay? And so in order to do that, I'm gonna teach in a different style than I usually do. Those of you who've taken classes with me, you know that I give plenty of chances for you to ask questions. And sometimes the Q&A can take a very long time. I'm not gonna do that in this class. So what we're gonna do is, I am not going to take any questions from the floor. What I want you to do is, you have any questions, I want you to put it on the WhatsApp group. I want you to put it on the WhatsApp group, okay? Even if you're on Zoom, you have a question, don't put it on Zoom, put it on the WhatsApp group, okay? Unless I say something and it's not clear, or maybe I misspoke, you can raise your hand and you can ask for a quick clarification, okay? But anything beyond a quick clarification question needs to be a written question, and it needs to be put on the WhatsApp group. And what I will do is, I will have select times when I will answer those questions in class, okay? And when I'm answering those questions, then you are allowed to ask follow-up questions. So at that point, you can raise your hand and ask a follow-up, okay? But you cannot ask a new question. The new question has to be on the WhatsApp group. So most likely, the first Q&A session is going to be after lunch today. After lunch, meaning at 2:30 p.m., inshallah. So you have between now and 2:30, in all the breaks, you can think carefully how to articulate your questions that come to your mind. You can write them down, and then once you have them written down, you want to type them and put them on the WhatsApp group, you can do that, inshallah ta'ala. But please don't hesitate to ask questions. I don't mind you asking questions. We just want to do it in an organized fashion, inshallah, so that we don't waste time. Um, 2:30, but Zohar is 2:30. Sorry, oh, Zohar is what time? 2:30. Oh, Zohar is at 2:30 on Saturdays and Sundays. It's 2 o'clock every other day. I see. Okay, so we're gonna have to readjust the schedule. So I'll do that in the break, inshallah. I'll modify the schedule and then I'll share with everybody. I didn't realize that Dhuhr was at 2:30. We'll make changes, inshallah. So that's with regards to the Q&A. And other than that, everybody who's here should have received a notebook. Anybody who's not here can get a notebook by coming here, or now or later you can get your copy of the notebook. Otherwise, you can use a PDF copy of the lecture notes, and that PDF has already been uploaded to the student portal. Anybody who is attending a Ma'arifa class for the first time, please take some time to take a look at our website, which is taqwaseminary.org. And when you go there, you'll see a tab for Ma'arifa. Just click on Learn More, and you'll see what the Ma'arifa program is all about, what are the different courses that are taught. This is one of 16 courses that are offered here. You'll see the audit policy as well. So you can take courses as an auditor, in which case, you have access to all the course material, but you do not receive credit for the courses. And if you have any questions, there's an email address there where you can also send an email to ask questions. Anybody who is attending this class also for the first time, I guess you should also know that by registering for this course, you have access to the lecture recordings. And the way that you get access to the lecture recordings is by going to the student portal. And the link for the student portal is on the WhatsApp group, in the description of the WhatsApp group. And the the student portal can also be accessed from the website, from the course page. So you go to the student portal, and that's where you'll get access to the lecture recordings, as well as any notes and handouts that I want to share with you. If you have any questions, you can always post them on the WhatsApp group. If you have a question for me, make sure you tag me by using the @ symbol. Make sure you tag me by using the @ symbol. If you have a question for the TA, Sister Sharmeen, you can tag her by using the @ symbol as well. And the rest should be pretty straightforward, inshallah. Any questions before we begin? Questions before we begin? Yes. How do you get on the WhatsApp group? When did you register for this class?
I just yesterday, so I'm
You just registering right now. Okay. So how should he get on the WhatsApp group?
You want me to reach out a QR code
Can you do that?
for the WhatsApp group?
I think it would be better if we do it in the break. So in the break, you can talk to Sister Sharmeen and she'll help you get on the WhatsApp group, inshallah. We just want to make sure that only registered students get access to the WhatsApp group. So, inshallah. All right. Any other questions? Let's begin. Bismillah. So this course is called USL-102, Islamic Legal Theory. I am your instructor. My name is Arsalan Haq. If you have any questions about any of the course material that you don't want to ask publicly on the WhatsApp group, you're welcome to email me. And my email address, you may want to write it down if you don't know it already. It's Taqwa Director. Taqwa, T-A-Q-W-A, Taqwa Director, one word, at planomasjid.org. Okay. So any questions that you have about the course material, don't private message me on WhatsApp. I will not respond to it. I will completely ignore you. Either tag me on the course group or email me, inshallah. What is this seminar all about? Well, we are going to cover 3 topics in this seminar. 3 major topics. And every major topic has many subtopics, okay? So the 3 major topics that we're going to cover in this seminar, number 1 is Usulul Fiqh, Islamic Legal Theory. That's going to be part 1. And that's going to be the majority of the seminar, okay? All day today, we will be doing part 1. And then tomorrow, for the first 2 sessions, we will also be doing part 1, okay? So the majority of the seminar is part 1. But then after that, we will also do part 2, which is Maqasid al-Sharia, higher objectives of Islamic law. And then part 3, which is the status of bid'ah or innovation. So this is the plan, inshallah, for the seminar. These are the 3 major topics that we're going to cover. So let's begin with the first one, which is Usulul Fiqh, Islamic Legal Theory. First thing that we want to talk about is what is Usulul Fiqh? Even this word, Usulul Fiqh, may be new to some of you. Or maybe you have heard the word before, but you never quite learned what it means. The word Usulul Fiqh means the foundations or sources of Islamic law. Usul is an Arabic word which means foundations, or it also means sources. Asl is the singular form and usul is the plural form. So aslu shajara is the root of a tree, foundation of a tree, okay? So usul are the foundations or the sources of Islamic law. Islamic law, we all know, Islamic law is fiqh, you know. how to pray, how to fast, what breaks the prayer, what breaks the fast, how to get married, how to properly get divorced, what are the rights and responsibilities of husbands and wives, and what is a valid trade transaction, and what is a valid rental agreement, and what are the Islamic forms of punishment for various kinds of crimes. And this is all fiqh. What are the foundations of all these things? Where do the scholars get all this from? That for this crime, there's this punishment, and this is a crime, and this is not a crime, and this is what a wife has to do, and this is what a husband has to do, and this is what breaks the fast, and this is what breaks the prayer. Where do they get, how do they build all this fiqh, this law? Well, that's what usul al-fiqh teaches us, the foundations or sources of Islamic law. Our scholars love definitions. And so they have a definition for usul al-fiqh as well. The definition of usul al-fiqh is that this is a discipline that defines the sources of Islamic law, the methodology of its derivation, and the qualifications of those who may derive it. So this is a discipline that defines the sources of Islamic law, the methodology of its derivation, meaning how the law is derived, and the qualifications of those who may derive it. So this definition can be broken down into 4 parts. Okay? Usul al-fiqh is a discipline that comprises of 4 major topics. The discipline of usul al-fiqh. If you pick up any book in usul al-fiqh, like this one, for example, that I'll tell you about a little bit later, or this one that I have in Arabic, for example, any book in usul al-fiqh, any complete book in usul al-fiqh, you'll find that it has 4 major sections, 4 major parts. The first part talks about the law, al-hukm al-shar'i, the law. And we'll talk about that as well in this course. That's actually the first part of usul al-fiqh that we're going to be covering. B is the sources of Islamic law. What are the sources of Islamic law? And that's going to be the second part of what we're going to be talking about. Yarhamukallah. So after we talk about the law, we'll talk about the sources of Islamic law. And then the rules of interpretation. How do the ulama interpret the sources of law to derive law? What is the methodology of going from B to A? Going from the sources to the law. How do you derive law from its sources? There's a proper methodology for that. And that is studied in usul al-fiqh. And number 4, what are the qualifications of those who may do that interpretive exercise? There are qualifications that have to be met. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody can derive law from the Quran and Sunnah. You have to be qualified to do that. Just like not anybody can operate on a person, you have to be a qualified surgeon to be able to do that. Now, D is crossed out. The reason why it's crossed out is because it has already been covered in Usul 101. We've already talked about the qualifications of the mujtahid when we talked about ijtihad and taqleed in Usul 101. So those of you who have taken Usul 101, you can go back to your notes and you will find it at the very end of Usul 101. When we talked about ijtihad and taqleed, we talked about the qualifications of the mujtahid. Those are the qualifications of the interpreter. Okay? But A, B, and C, we're going to talk about in this seminar. Insha'Allah ta'ala. A and B will be talked about today. C will be talked about tomorrow. why should we study usul al-fiqh? Why does anybody study usul al-fiqh? First, I'll tell you, why do people study usul al-fiqh in general? What is the aim behind the study of usul al-fiqh in general? And then I'll tell you why we are studying usul al-fiqh. Okay? So, why is usul al-fiqh studied? Number one, to form a sound legal opinion. In order for an alim, in order for a scholar to form a fatwa, a legal opinion, to formulate a fatwa about something, they must have proficiency in usul al-fiqh. Otherwise, they cannot do that. Because this is the discipline that teaches you how to derive law from the sources of Islamic law. And that's essentially what a mufti does. So in order to form a legal opinion that is sound, you must have proficiency in usul al-fiqh. If you don't have proficiency in usul al-fiqh, then you're going to form legal opinions that are messed up, that are inaccurate, that are incorrect. You're going to make mistakes. So that's number one. Number two, to recognize aberrant opinions. Proficiency in usul al-fiqh gives us the ability to recognize that this fatwa is wrong because it diverges from what usul al-fiqh teaches us. It's not using the proper methodology. Okay? So proficiency in usul al-fiqh helps us form sound legal opinions and also helps us distinguish a sound opinion from an aberrant or incorrect opinion. Aberrant is a word that means strange or odd or rejected. Okay? So the Arabic word for that is shadh. Shadh, a fatwa that is shadh. So now, of course, for those of you who have some background in tazkiyah, you know that in order to distinguish something correct from something incorrect, we need to have knowledge, but we also need to have a sound heart. A sound heart. So knowledge is required. Knowledge of usul al-fiqh is required to recognize aberrant opinions, but tazkiyah is also required. Purification of the heart is also required for that. And so, inshallah ta'ala, for those of you who have not taken tazkiyah classes before, you should know that tazkiyah is part of the Ma'rifah curriculum. And those of you who are following the curriculum here at the Allen Masjid, inshallah, the first course in Tazkiyah 101, will be offered soon, I believe in the summer, inshallah ta'ala, Tazkiyah 101, and then followed by Tazkiyah 201, inshallah ta'ala. Okay, and then the third reason why we study usul al-fiqh is to appreciate the juristic process. To appreciate the juristic process. Because when we study usul al-fiqh, we understand how sophisticated the process of formulating a fatwa is. How sophisticated the process is. And so we gain an appreciation for that. Whenever an alim does his job right, if we understand usul al-fiqh, we will appreciate that. We will recognize that. So why are we studying usul al-fiqh? We are studying usul al-fiqh primarily for reason number 3. And also for reason number 2. But not for reason number 1. This seminar, for us, the purpose is 3 and 2, not 1. Okay? Because we are not here to become ulama. That's not the objective of the Ma'rifah program. Okay? But those who are following this endeavor of becoming ulama, they study usul fiqh in depth for the purpose of number one, to gain that ability to formulate sound legal opinions. We're not going to go into that much depth. Okay, this is just an introduction to usul al-fiqh to help us appreciate the juristic process and also give us the ability to recognize aberrant opinions from opinions that are orthodox and sound. Now, when we have our weekly classes in the Ma'rifah program, we usually have textbooks that we require students to read. But for seminars, we cannot do that because it's an intensive course and you don't have time to read a textbook. So what I will require from you is to read some articles. Okay, and I will share those articles with you later, inshallah, that I will require from you to read, and then you'll be tested over those. Inshallah, we'll talk about the test later. But at the same time, I do want to recommend some books for you to read, especially if you would like to delve more into the subject of usul al-fiqh. Okay, and some of these books we actually used to require in the Ma'rifah program when the usul al-fiqh class was a semester-long class. But since we've done away with the semester-long class, this has now become recommended reading. Number one is the book of Imam al-Shafi'i, known as Ar-Risala. It is translated into English, and this is a book that we have talked about in Usul 101. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about it right now. We've talked about this book in Usul 101. This is the famous work of Imam Shafi'i called Ar-Risala, the very first book ever written in the subject of Usul al-Fiqh. Okay. Number two, Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence by Muhammad Hashim Kamali, published by the Islamic Texts Society. This is a dense book. It's a heavy read, but it is a very comprehensive work in the English language in the subject of Usul al-Fiqh, and it is taught in universities. Okay. Number three is a much simpler work compared to Kamali's work. This is a much simpler work, easier to digest, much more summarized, easier to read book, and it's called Introduction to Usul al-Fiqh by Farhan Zubairi, and it is this book right here. Okay, it's not that big. Alhamdulillah, it's much more accessible. So if you've never read anything in Usul al-Fiqh before, my recommendation would be to start with this one and then move up to Principles of Islamic Jurisprudence and then to Ar-Risala. Okay, these are the books that I would recommend. As far as the required reading is concerned, I am going to post a PDF on WhatsApp when we take our first break, inshallah. And that PDF is going to be a book by Dr. Taha Alwani. The book is called Source Methodology in Islamic Jurisprudence. I don't want you to read the whole book, even though it's not a long book. I mean, you can read the whole book, but what I'm going to require from you is just chapters 4 and 5 from that book. Just chapters 4 and 5 with just a few pages. And in those chapters, Dr. Alwani discusses why Imam Shafi'i wrote the Risala, which was the first book ever written in Usul al-Fiqh, and then what happened after he wrote the Risala. How from that book then, this discipline started to evolve in its initial stages. So it talks about basically the history of how this science developed, why it developed, and how it developed. And I think it's very important to have that background as you study Usul al-Fiqh. We're not going to have time to talk about that in the seminar, so I just want you to read about that from Dr. Alwani's book. It's pretty self-explanatory, inshallah. And then if you have questions, of course, you can post them on the WhatsApp group. Okay, so like I said, I'll share the PDF with you on the group in the break time, and then you will have a month to read the reading assignments, okay? Because the test is going to be after a month from today. And like I said, I'll tell you more about the test a little bit later, inshallah. Okay, So, since we said that usul al-fiqh comprises of these four things, and we have already talked about the fourth one, so we're going to talk about the law, the sources of law, and the rules of interpretation. Let's start with the first one, which is the law. Okay, the 1A, the law. Bismillah. الحكم الشرعي. What is al-hukm al-shari? That the word we're using in English is law, but what exactly is this term al-hukm al-shari? It is defined as God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who is legally responsible or mukallaf by way of a demand, permission, or declaration. Sheikh, if you can just give me 1 second, inshallah, to discuss something with the Sheikh. You have seen the schedule for today, right? It's on that group. The lunch. So that whole thing was made with the assumption that Dhuhr is going to be at 2.
Yeah, that was at 2:30.
But I was just told Dhuhr is at 2:30.
Yeah, on the
Will you
weekends.
please look at that schedule and suggest a modification to that based on, because that was based on Dhuhr being at 2. But now Dhuhr is at 2:30.
So
Can
lunch
you
should
just
be at
suggest?
1:45 instead.
You tell
Move to
me.
30 minutes. Yeah.
And is that too late for lunch? People. So just think about that, and then if you can just suggest it on the group, and I'll take a look at it during the break.
Okay.
Just make a
Do you
suggestion.
think it's too long for lunch? Like, hopefully lunch at the same time and resume time back before the holiday.
So I don't want the lunch to be longer than it is already in that schedule.
Okay. It's
That's
not
just, we just need to shift the time, but.
okay. Then, all right. I'll put it in check. Can I ask if anyone has any vegan preferences? All right. Assalamu alaikum. So I'm gonna be arranging for lunch. Does anyone have any vegetarian preference? Like non-beef or chicken? Anyone has beef with beef? No? Okay. There we go.
All right, so God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible or a mukallaf by way of a demand, permission, or declaration. So this is, of course, a very dense definition. We need to break this down in order to understand what this is talking about. And we're going to do it over the next few slides. So over the next few slides, we're going to talk about a few things. Number one, who is the lawgiver? Number two, who is legally responsible? Mukallaf. And number three, what are the different types of al-hukm al-shari? Okay. God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who is legally responsible, mukallaf, by way of a demand, permission, or declaration. So from here, we can already see that hukum shari is going to be, seems like 3 types: demands, permissions, and declarations. So we're going to get into that in number 3. And then we need to understand who is a legally responsible person. And then God's proclamation. So that tells me that God is a lawgiver, but is he the only lawgiver? We're going to discuss that in the next slide. Okay. Now, before I go on, just one more note here. How does God proclaim something? God proclaims something either directly or indirectly. God's proclamations reach us human beings either directly or indirectly. Directly in the form of the Quran. Quran is God's direct communication in his words through Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to humanity. So that's direct speech of God, direct proclamation of God. The indirect speech of God to us is through the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the sunnah of the Prophet, the verbal teachings and the practical teachings of the Prophet are also God's proclamation, but through the medium of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his words, his actions, his explanations, and so on. Okay. Now, moving on then, that raises a question. Who is the lawgiver? Allah is definitely the lawgiver. What about the Prophet? Is the Prophet considered a lawgiver, a lawmaker? Or is he simply a communicator of law? Is he simply an explainer of the law? Or is he someone who can make law as well? So, of course, everybody would answer, yes, the Prophet communicates divine law, and he explains divine law, and he applies the divine law and shows us how it should be applied. But is it possible that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to make law independently? And the answer to that is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is allowed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to form and communicate law independently from the Quran, but not independently from Allah, if that makes sense. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ can say, this is haram, and it's not in the Quran. The Quran lists for us women that are haram for us. حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ, and so on. Your mothers are haram for you, and your daughters are haram for you, and your sisters are haram for you. Lists for us women that are haram. The Prophet ﷺ can come and say, and add to this list, she is also haram for you. He has the authority by God to do that, to add to the Quran, but not independently from Allah. Okay? Because anything that he says has to be based on wahi. وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. And therefore, we say that the sunnah is the second form of wahi. It's the second form of revelation. And we talk about that in Hadith 101. Okay? So there is, Quran is the first form of wahi, the first form of revelation, God's verbatim revelation to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the sunnah is also God's revelation, but not verbatim from God. The words are the Prophet's, but the content is from Allah Azza wa Jal. And therefore, that makes the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam also a lawmaker. He can make laws in addition to what the Quran contains, but not independently from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What about the human intellect? Is the human intellect allowed to be used to make laws, religious laws, independently from the Quran and the Sunnah? If something seems to be moral to me, then it must be permissible, at the least, if not good, if not recommended and required. And if something seems to be immoral to me, then it must be haram. Can the human intellect be used in that way? Believe it or not, Muslim scholars have differed on this issue. Muslim scholars, not Sunni scholars. Muslim scholars have differed on this issue. And historically, there was a divide on this issue between the Sunni scholars and a sect of non-Sunni scholars. And that sect is called the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila, or the Mu'tazilites. The Mu'tazila, inshallah, you learn more about them in the Aqidah 101 class that, or you probably already did. In the Aqidah 101 class, you probably heard about them from Imam ARB. The Mu'tazila, as a sect, had certain beliefs where they differed from the Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And so this is another one of those issues where they disagreed with the Sunni Muslims. The Mu'tazila believed that the human reason is capable of discovering the legal ruling of something on its own. That Allah had created the human being with this ability, this noble ability, that we have the ability to discover the divine ruling for something. Is this halal or haram? Without even the presence of revelation. And this, they said, based on a belief that they had, based on another belief that they had. And their belief was that the human mind is given the ability by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to discern what is good and moral from that which is evil and immoral. That this is ingrained in our fitrah. And so by our natural disposition, Allah has placed it within us that we are repulsed by evil and we are attracted to good. And so anything whose benefit or harm is obvious, not obscure or hidden, right? Anything whose harm or benefit is obvious, then the human reason is capable of discovering the legal ruling of that independently from the Sharia. And then they said that the Sharia simply comes to confirm the judgment of human reason. And therefore, they said that if the Sharia is silent about an issue, our mind is capable of discovering its legal ruling. And that is trustworthy, and we can rely on that. The Sunnis didn't exactly agree with this whole thing. But the Sunnis also had two different opinions regarding this issue. And so in Aqidah, you learn about the Ash'ari school and the Maturidi school. There are these two major groups, these two major madhabs of Aqidah within Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, known as the Ash'ari school and the Maturidi school that you've learned about in the Aqidah class. So the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they had a slightly different opinion about this issue of whether or not the human intellect can be relied upon to derive the legal ruling of an issue. The Ash'aris first, they said, so Ash'aris are the likes of Imam Razi, Imam al-Ghazali, and so on, that divine rulings can only be derived through God's prophets and messengers. Things are not intrinsically good or bad. Water is not intrinsically good. It's good because Allah told us it's good. Wine is not intrinsically bad. It's bad because Allah told us that it's bad. So things are not intrinsically good or bad. If the law considers something to be good, then it is beneficial. If the law considers something to be evil, then it is harmful. The law considers homosexuality to be evil, therefore it is harmful. The law considers cousin marriages to be halal, therefore it is beneficial. Okay? So this is the Ash'ari approach. We cannot trust human reason at all. We have to go with what the law says. What if the law considers something to be good, then it's beneficial. If the law considers something to be bad, then it's harmful. The Maturidis had an opinion sort of in between the Ash'aris and the Mu'tazila. In between. The Maturidis are the likes of Imam Tahawi and others. Many of the Hanafi ulama are Maturidis. They said that human reason is capable of distinguishing good from bad. So they don't have a mistrust of human reason like the Ash'aris do. They say, no, Allah has given us this fitrah. And so human reason is capable of distinguishing good from bad. However, we cannot rely upon human reason to derive the legal ruling. We have to derive the legal ruling from the sources of Sharia because human reason is affected by its environment. It can be corrupted by the environment. And so we cannot trust it absolutely. Okay? So, in summary, let us ask two questions. Question number one, is human reason inherently capable of distinguishing good from evil? And question number two, can human reason be trusted to pronounce a legal ruling about an issue independently from the sources of Sharia? The answer to question number one, again, question number one was, is human reason inherently capable of distinguishing good from evil? Is human reason inherently capable of distinguishing good from evil? Who said no to this question from the Ash'aris and Maturidis and the Mu'tazila? Who said no? Ash'aris. Ash'aris said no to this question, whereas the Mu'tazila and the Maturidis say yes to this question. Both of them say yes to this question. But then the second question is, can human reason be trusted to pronounce a legal ruling independently from the sources of Sharia? Who said no to this question? Ash'aris and Maturidis say no to this question. Who said yes to this one? Mu'tazila. Okay? Alhamdulillah. All right. The next question that needs to be answered is, who is legally responsible? Mukallaf. Mukallaf. The word for legal responsibility is taklif. Taklif. And so the legally responsible person is called a mukallaf. Okay? Now, what and who is legally responsible? A legally responsible person is someone who's able to understand and fulfill the demand of the lawgiver. Okay? So once somebody is able to understand and fulfill the demand of the lawgiver, well, then there's accountability. If you understand and you have the ability to fulfill the demand and you don't, then you're going to be punishable. And if you do, you're going to be rewardable, right? So reward and punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only for the mukallaf. And that's why we say that children are, in Urdu we say they're masoom, meaning they're innocent, even if they, break somebody's arm. Because they're not mukallaf. They're not able to understand and fulfill the demand of the lawgiver. So they are not mukallaf. Okay? A cat is not mukallaf. But a Muslim who's 30 years old, fully sane, fully awake, without any compulsion, right, is a mukallaf. There's expectation from that person. So legally responsible. So legally responsible person is someone who's able to understand and fulfill the demand of the lawgiver. So what are the necessary qualities that have to be checked in order for someone to be considered mukallaf. Number one, you have to be alive. A person who's not alive is not mukallaf. Somebody who's died and the adhan for Maghrib is called, not expected to pray Maghrib. They're not mukallaf. Okay? So you have to be alive, number one. Number two, you have to be conscious. So somebody who's unconscious is not a mukallaf. Somebody is unconscious for the whole day. They're not mukallaf to fast that day. They're unconscious. Right? They missed the whole day of fasting. It's okay. They were unconscious. They're not mukallaf. They're not punished for that. Somebody who's asleep is not mukallaf. They're not conscious. They're asleep. Somebody falls asleep after Asr and wakes up at Isha. Are they sinful for having missed Maghrib? No. Why not? Because they were not mukallaf. They were asleep. Now they have to make it up. That's a different demand. That's a separate demand, the demand to make up. But the demand to pray on time, that demand they were not able to fulfill because they were asleep. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said the qalam, the pen is lifted from the one who's asleep. In other words, the pen is lifted, meaning no sin is being recorded. You're asleep. Someone who forgets is not mukallaf, because even though they're conscious, but they're not conscious about that particular issue at that particular time. They're not. So they're not mukallaf. I forgetfully drink water while I'm fasting. I forgetfully drink water. Am I sinful for drinking water? No. I eat a whole plate of biryani because I don't remember that I was fasting. I'm not sinful for that because I'm not mukallaf. I completely forget that I haven't prayed until the next prayer comes in. Completely. Just honest forgetfulness. I'm not mukallaf. I have to make it up. That's a separate demand. The demand to make up is a separate demand. But the demand to pray on time, I'm not responsible for not fulfilling that demand because I was not in a state of consciousness about that at that time. So, death is a nullifier of taklif. Unconsciousness is a nullifier of taklif. Sleep, forgetfulness, these are nullifiers of taklif. What else do I have to be in order to be legally responsible? I have to be sane. Because if I'm not sane, then I can't understand the demand of the lawgiver. And so somebody who is insane is not required to pray. People with mental challenges, right? Genetic abnormalities, who don't have sanity, they're not required to pray, to fast, because they're not mukallaf. Somebody who is intoxicated, is also not fully sane. And so they are also not mukallaf. However, that is only if they have been intoxicated involuntarily. But somebody who has deliberately intoxicated themselves, rebelling against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are treated like a mukallaf person even though their mind is not there, because they rebelled against Allah and took the intoxicant. All right? But somebody who is intoxicated, not as an act of rebellion, either that was done to them by compulsion, or it happened by accident, or it happened for medical treatment that was required, for example, and that person becomes intoxicated, now they're not mukallaf. because they don't have sanity. Okay? Mature. Person has to be mature. They have to be above the age of puberty to be mukallaf. And so we are not punished for sins unless we are above the age of puberty. So a child is not mukallaf. Infancy is a nullifier of taklif. Just like insanity is a nullifier of taklif. And the last thing is being uncompelled. I have to be uncompelled in order to be a mukallaf. So if I'm compelled, then I am not mukallaf. I am compelled to, for example, drink alcohol. On gunpoint, you will drink this. You will eat this plate of pork. Like, subhanAllah, some of our brothers and sisters in Gaza are going through these kinds of things, right? So they're made to eat pork. They're made to drink urine or alcohol or whatever. Are they sinful for that? Absolutely not. Why? Because they're compelled, and compulsion is a nullifier of taklif. Okay? Now, all of these things are nullifiers of taklif. Death, unconsciousness, insanity, infancy, being compelled, and so on. These are nullifiers of taklif. Please make a note somewhere that these are not nullifiers of wad'. Wad'. Wow, dad, ayn. Wad'. Because we're going to talk about hukum taklifi and hukum wad'i. Hukum taklifi and hukum wad'i. These are nullifiers of taklif. These are not nullifiers of wad'. Okay? And once we learn what hukum wad'i is, then you'll go back to this note and you will understand what it means. But just to briefly explain it right now, what this means is, and again, you'll learn it, you'll understand it more as we go along, is let's say that a child, let's say my child goes to your car and they take their baseball bat and they break your car window. Now the child is not mukallaf, which means that the child is not punished for this, neither in the afterlife nor in an Islamic state, right? Because he's not mukallaf. But hukum wad'i there would necessitate that wherever there's a cause, there's an effect. So the cause of breaking a window requires compensation. So me, as the father of that child, have to compensate for your broken window from the wealth of the child, if the child owns any wealth. And if not, then from my own wealth. Okay? That's hukum wad'i, that's wad'. These are not nullifiers of wad'. Okay? An intoxicated person does some damage. After they come back to their senses, they have to pay for the damages. They're not punishable in Sharia. They're not going to be punished by the court, and they're not going to be punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the compensation has to be made because that's hukum wad'i, not hukum taklif. All right? So these are nullifiers of taklif, not wad'. All right. We have 15 minutes, right? Inshallah. Okay. Now, there are two types of hukum. Okay, so let's go back here. We said al-hukum shar'i is God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible by way of demand, permission, or declaration. We talked about who the lawgiver is. We talked about who the mukallaf is and who is not a mukallaf. Now we need to talk about the different types of hukum shar'i. And what I'm saying is that there are not three, but two types of hukum shar'i. There are two types of hukum shar'i. Number one is al-hukm al-taklifi, and the other one is al-hukm al-wad'i. And once again, I have the definition of al-hukm al-shar'i here. Al-hukm al-taklifi is God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible by way of a demand or a permission. And hukum wad'i is God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible by way of a declaration. Okay, so demand and permission constitute taklifi, defining law, and declaration constitutes wad'i or declaratory law. We're going to talk about hukum taklifi first, and then we will talk about hukum wad'i, inshallah ta'ala. Okay? Defining law or al-hukm taklifi. Obligation, recommendation, dislike, prohibition, permission. Okay? Let's go back. God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible by way of a permission. That's right here. Permission. In other words, when we look at, for example, the Quran, and the Quran, for example, says, "Uhilla lakum." The following is permitted for you. Uhilla lakum ليلة الصيام الرفث إلى نسائكم. For example, it is permitted for you to have intimate relations with your wives on the nights of Ramadan. That's God's proclamation. That ayah right there, that's God's proclamation regarding the action. Sexual intercourse is an action. Regarding the action of someone who's legally responsible, husbands and wives. These are adults, alive, sane, alert, awake, right? Legally responsible by way of a permission. That's a type of hukum shari'i. It's a type of hukum taklifi, because it has to do with permission. And then there are demands, and those demands are divided into obligations, recommendations, dislikes, and prohibitions. Because a demand can be a binding demand or a non-binding demand. A binding demand is obligation or prohibition, wajib, haram. Okay? Binding demand to do something, obligation. Binding demand to refrain from something, prohibition. Or a non-binding demand to do something, recommendation. Non-binding demand to refrain from something, dislike, karaha. And so, al-hukm al-taklifi is obligation, recommendation, dislike, prohibition, and permission. An obligation is a binding demand from the lawgiver to perform something. A recommendation is a non-binding demand from the lawgiver to perform something. A dislike is a non-binding demand from the lawgiver to abandon something. Prohibition is a binding demand from the lawgiver to abandon something. And permission is a permission from the lawgiver to perform or abandon an action. Now, what's the difference between binding and non-binding? First of all, I'll give you a mundane example, and then I'll give you a religious example, a Quranic example, okay? In mundane sense, look, for example, when I speak to my child, I can make certain demands from my children, or I can make certain demands as a teacher from my students, okay? So if I'm talking to my child, right, and I say to my child, I see my child playing a video game, and I say to my child, why don't you read a book? Does that sound like a binding demand or a non-binding demand? Non-binding, right? If I was to say to my child, stop playing and read a book. You see the difference between the two? me saying, why don't you read a book? Versus stop playing and read a book. There's clearly a difference between the two demands. The first one is what we call non-binding. In other words, if he doesn't listen to me, I will not be able to punish him. But if I say to him, stop playing and read a book, and I still see him playing video games, now these are grounds for perhaps being grounded. Okay, why? Because this was a binding demand. So that's the difference between a binding demand and a non-binding demand in a mundane sense. In the Quranic example, or example from the Sunnah, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said in a hadith, "Sallu qabla al-maghrib, sallu qabla al-maghrib, sallu qabla al-maghrib, liman sha'a." He said, pray before Maghrib. Pray before Maghrib if you want. If you want. Now compare that to when the Quran says, "Awfu bil-uqud." Period. Fulfill your agreements. There's a difference between the two demands. The demand of the Prophet ﷺ is pray before Maghrib if you want, versus fulfill your agreements. Fulfill your agreements. That's a binding demand. And that's why we say it's obligatory to fulfill your agreements. But praying before Maghrib, if you want, that's a non-binding demand. That's an encouragement. That's a recommendation. And that's why we say it's mustahab, according to non-Hanafis. It's mustahab to pray 2 rak'ah before Maghrib, according to Shafi'is and Hanbalis. Okay? Mustahab, not required, even though there's a demand, pray before Maghrib, but it's a non-binding demand. So it's a recommendation, not an obligation. Another example of a binding demand versus non-binding demand to abandon something, for example. Again, a mundane example first. If I see my child playing, and I say to my child, stop playing. Stop playing. Versus if I say to my child, you've been playing for so long, why don't you read a book? In both cases, I'm demanding from the child to stop playing. But in the first case, it's a binding demand. Stop playing. I'm not giving any options here. But in the second case, I'm saying you've been playing for so long. Why don't you read a book? That's a non-binding demand to abandon playing. So the first example will be the example of a prohibition. The second example will be the example of something that's disliked. I don't like that you are playing for so long. So now in the Shari'i sense, an example would be from the hadith, let's say, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited us from urinating while standing. But then on some occasions, he urinated while standing. That indicates to the scholar that his demand not to stand while standing was what kind of a demand? Non-binding demand. A dislike, non-binding demand. Okay. Now, there is a topic that we are supposed to cover as part of this course, which is the topic of qawaid fiqhiyya, legal axioms. Legal axioms. And throughout the course, this entire course is sprinkled with legal axioms. So this is the very first case of where we're going to see a legal axiom. Legal axioms are basically phrases that are constructed by ulama, by fuqaha, by jurists, that are constructed after surveying Islamic law, various aspects of Islamic law. And these phrases, they encapsulate in them a pattern that is seen in Islamic law. After doing a survey of Islamic law, if there's a repeated pattern, that pattern is encapsulated in an axiom. And then this axiom serves as a useful tool for future fatwa about new issues. When there's an established pattern, you can use that pattern then to pronounce a judgment about something else that is similar to this pattern. Okay, instead of going through the arduous work of going back to the Quran and Sunnah, if this fits a pattern that's already established, khalas, that's it. So legal axioms are used by ulama very frequently, and they're called qawaid fiqhiyya, and this is one legal axiom that is related to what we are talking about. And that is that the default ruling for all things is permissibility. Al-aslu fil ashya'i al-ibaha. This means what? That even though the lawgiver can make something an obligation or recommendation or dislike or prohibition or permission, if we don't have any proof from the Sharia that something is this or that, because maybe it's a new issue. Let's say there's a new type of trade transaction, right? Dealing with cryptocurrency, for example, right? And at the very beginning, we don't know. This is completely new. We don't know lab-grown stuff, for example. We don't know whether this is halal or haram. Al-aslu, the default ruling, things by default are permissible until they are proven to be one of the other four. Okay, so cryptocurrency, at the very beginning when it came out, since there was no verdict on it, okay, it's permissible to deal in cryptocurrency until somebody can prove that it is not permissible. Al-aslu fil ashya'i al-ibaha. Now, does this legal axiom, it's a very useful legal axiom, but does this apply to every single thing? The answer is no. Most legal axioms have exceptions. And this is also similar. So are there exceptions to this legal axiom? Yes. There are 3 exceptions to this legal axiom. For 3 things, the default ruling is the opposite. It is impermissibility. 3 things are by default impermissible until a faqih can tell you they are permissible. And he has to have dalil for it, obviously. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a faqih. And what are the 3 things? Does anybody know? What are the 3 exceptions? Number 1.
One being like the meat being halal.
Yes. Now, number 1 is meat. Meat. So meat by default is impermissible to consume unless you can prove that it is permissible. Okay. So, for example, let's say that I shoot, say Bismillah, I shoot with an arrow or with a gun, a deer. Deer is running, I shoot it. And it runs and it jumps into a lake. And then I run after it and I find the dead deer in the lake and I bring it out. Actually, before that, because actually this is something a lot of people don't know. Scratch that. Different example. It's 10:45. Just give me 3 minutes, inshallah. Let's say I shoot a deer. Bismillah, I shoot a deer, right? And it's shot, it falls, I run after it, I get to it, it's died. Can I eat it? Can I eat the deer? But I didn't slaughter it. Huh? I said Bismillah, but I didn't slaughter it. Can I eat it? Yes, I can eat it. Yes, I can eat. That's why hunting is allowed, People used to hunt all the time in the past. That's how they used to eat. It's not always possible to slaughter the animal. By the time you get to the animal, it's dead. You shoot a bird, it falls, dies. It's dead. Shoot a rabbit, it's dead. It dies, right? You use hunting dogs. In the Quran talks about using hunting dogs. You release a hunting dog, dog runs after an animal, and you run after it. After a while, you get to it, you find that the dog has killed the animal. The animal's dead. And it's halal for you to eat it because this is hunting. Hunting is allowed, right? So we have to slaughter animals to eat them in regular circumstances. But in hunting, we say Bismillah and we use the tool of hunting, whether it's a gun or an arrow or a dog, right? Or a stone or whatever it is. And then that kills the animal. It's halal for us to eat. Now we go to the other example. I shoot the deer. The deer runs into a lake, falls into a lake. I go to the lake. I pull out the dead body of the deer. Is the deer halal for me? You say no. Why not?
Deer could possibly drown.
It could have died by drowning. Could have died by drowning. Could have also died from the gunshot. Could have died from the gunshot, right? Both possibilities are there. So the default in meat is that it is impermissible. And since I have no proof that it died from my gunshot, I can't eat it. Can't eat it. Okay? The second exception is marriage. I cannot get married to a woman unless I know she's not my mahram. Unless I know she's not my mahram. Okay? I have an aunt. Let's say that I have two aunts. Okay? My mom has two sisters. And each of those two aunts have a daughter. All right? So I have two female cousins from two aunts. Are they my mahram? Are they my mahram? No. Can I marry them? Yes. But my mother says that, I nursed one of them when she was a baby. I nursed one of them when she was a baby. You were young and they were young. All of you are the same age. I nursed one of them. I don't remember which one. One of them I nursed. So one of those two cousins is now my mahram. The other one is not. I don't know which one. Can I marry one of them? No. Because the default is that they are all haram for me unless I can ascertain that she is halal for me. Okay? And number 3 is worship. I cannot worship Allah using a method unless I have proof that that method is allowed by Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? I want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and come close to Him by lighting a candle at somebody's death. Somebody died. Now there's a night vigil going on. Everybody's going and lighting candles. So I light a candle and I'm doing that as a way of coming closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. It's not allowed because there is no proof that this is a method of worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I need proof in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this is a legitimate way of worshiping Him. Okay? Let's stop here, inshallah ta'ala. It's 10:50. So that gives us 10 minutes. Okay. 10-minute break, inshallah. We're going to resume at 11 o'clock sharp. Jazakumullah khairan. Okay, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So just want to let you know that we have updated the schedule for today slightly. And the updated schedule is posted on the WhatsApp group. So now this session, which is session 2, will go until 12:15, inshallah. So we'll take our next break at 12:15, inshallah. And then the session 3 will be from 12:30 to 1:30. And then at 1:30, we will take our break for lunch and dhuhr. And then we will have session 4 at 2:50. And the rest of the schedule will be the same, inshallah. All right, so once again, please keep me on check. So we're supposed to go until 12:15, inshallah. And I don't see any questions yet on the WhatsApp group. So that's good for me. Less work for me. But I want to again emphasize that if you have any questions, please, by all means, feel free to post them on the WhatsApp group. And then I will have a chance to look at them during the lunch break and provide answers right after the lunch break, inshallah. All right. So we were talking about al-hukm al-taklifi, right? We were talking about, first of all, we're talking about usul al-fiqh. And within usul al-fiqh, we're talking about al-hukm al-shar'i. And we said al-hukm al-shar'i is divided into two types, defining law and declaratory law, al-hukm al-taklifi and hukm al-wad'i. We're currently talking about the first one, which is al-hukm al-taklifi. And we said that al-hukm al-taklifi is of 5 types: obligation, recommendation, dislike, prohibition, and permission. And we talked about the legal axiom, al-aslu fil ashya'i al-ibaha, that the default ruling for all things is permissibility. Is it permissible for me to use an iPhone? Yes. Is it permissible for me to use a Samsung? Yes. By default, yes, unless somebody can prove that it is not permissible, okay? But there are 3 exceptions, and that is meat, marriage, and worship, in which the default is impermissibility until somebody can prove that it is permissible. Moving on, inshallah ta'ala, from these 5, we get the 5 legal rulings, okay? This has to do with our actions are either obligatory or recommended or reprehensible or prohibited or permissible. There's just a slight difference between the previous slide and this one. The previous slide was obligation. This is obligatory. The previous slide was recommendation. This is recommended. It's just looking at the same thing from 2 different perspectives. Previously, we were looking at it from the perspective of God. So God making something an obligation, recommendation, God's pronouncements, God's proclamations, God's communication makes something into obligatory. Now, from our perspective, that action is either obligatory or recommended or reprehensible or prohibited or permissible. So when we say that an action is obligatory, from our perspective, what that means is that that action is rewardable. And if I don't do it, I'm punishable, right? From God's perspective, that was a binding demand to do something. That's from God. From our perspective now, if I do that, then I can expect to be rewarded. And if I don't do that, I can expect to be punished. A recommended action is an action whose performance is rewardable, but non-performance is punishable. Right? If I do it, I'm rewarded. If I don't do it, I'm not punished. Not punished. Okay? 2 rak'ah salah after Isha. If I do it, I'm rewarded. If I don't do it, I'm not punished. But the 4 rak'ah fard of Isha, wajib, obligatory. If I do it, I'm rewarded. If I don't do it, I'm punished. Reprehensible, makruh, an action whose non-performance is rewardable, but performance is not punishable. If I don't do it, I'm rewarded. If I don't do it, I'm rewarded. Okay? So, for example, it is makruh to sleep after Asr. it is makruh to engage in socializing after Isha. Makruh to socialize after Isha. If I avoid it because it's makruh, I can expect to be rewarded by Allah. I'm getting sleepy, but I tell myself, no, I'm not going to sleep until I pray my Maghrib. Still 1 hour and a half until Maghrib. No, after Asr, it's makruh to sleep, so I'm not going to sleep. I'll be rewarded, inshallah. But if I do sleep, I'm not sinful. If I do socialize after Isha, I'm not sinful, as long as I'm not doing anything haram in that social activity. Number 4, prohibited, an action whose performance is punishable and non-performance is rewardable. Okay, drinking alcohol, haram. If I drink it, I'm punishable. If I have alcohol in front of me and I avoid it because I know that Allah has made this haram, so I'm not going to drink it, even though the bottle looks so nice and everybody's enjoying this, but I'm not going to. I'll be rewarded. And then number 5, permissible, an action whose performance and non-performance are neither rewardable nor punishable. Mubah. Now, two things before we move on to the next slide. One thing about mandub. Mandub. According to the non-Hanafis, and this is all non-Hanafi because next slide is about the Hanafi classification. Hanafis have a slightly different way of classifying things. According to non-Hanafis, particularly the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis, there are other words that are used that are synonymous, completely synonymous to mandub in the Shafi'i and Hanbali paradigm. Completely interchangeable with mandub. What are those other words? Mustahab and sunnah and nafil. These are all interchangeable words, completely synonymous. Sunnah, nafil, mandub, mustahab. Okay, so an action whose performance is rewardable but non-performance is not punishable is sunnah or mandub or nafil or mustahab. Regardless of whether it's sunnah mu'akkada or ghayr mu'akkada, it doesn't matter. Strongly recommended or mildly recommended, doesn't matter. From this definition's perspective, they're all the same. It's just that which is sunnah mu'akkada or strongly recommended, the reward is more. Sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, the reward is less. That's it. And the other thing, before we go on to the next slide, is, this is important because a lot of people, they ask, is Taraweeh sunnah or nafil? And the answer is, well, which worldview are you coming from? Are you coming from the Shafi'i Hanbali worldview? If you're coming from that worldview, then it is both sunnah and nafil because they're both the same thing. They're both the same thing. These are two synonymous terms. But if you're coming from the worldview of the Hanafis, that's a different. And we'll get to that, inshallah. All right, the other thing before we go on is in these terms, these 5 terms that you see in front of you, there's a term missing that somebody might expect to see here. See, you have the term haram. What's the opposite of haram? Halal. Where's halal? It's not there. So where does halal go here? Anybody want to take a stab at this? Where do you put halal in this? Yes. He says 5. He's saying halal is a synonym for mubah. Does anybody have another opinion? Yes.
Because of the axiom that everything's halal unless everything's permissible.
Yeah, the axiom was everything is what?
Halal.
What was the Arabic word? Ibaha. Mubah, not halal. What else? Anybody else? Yes?
Except for number 4, everything is covered.
Yes, you are right. Fatahallahu alayk. Except for number 4, all of them are halal. So halal is a broader term that includes 1, 2, 3, and 5. So makruh is haram? No, it's halal. Makruh is halal. It's not mubah, but it's halal. Fard is also halal. It's more than mubah, but it's halal. So halal is anything that is not haram. And that includes 1, 2, 3, and 5. Okay? And the synonym for halal is not mubah. The synonym for halal is jaiz. Jaiz. Okay? Jaiz. All right. Now, the Hanafi classification. For the Hanafis, hukum taklifi is not 5 things, it's 7. 7. They have something called fard and something called wajib. And they are not the same, they are different. And they have something called makruh tanzihi and something called makruh tahrimi and something called haram. And the 3 of them are not the same, they are different. So now, in order to understand the Hanafi classification, we need to understand something else. So we'll go and talk about that, and then we will come back to this. In order to understand the Hanafi classification, we need to understand the difference between definitive and probabilistic. Qat'i and dhanni. Qat'i is definitive, just from the English language here. Definitive is something about which there's hardly any doubt, right? Whereas probabilistic is something that could be this way or could be that way. Okay? So now, there are things in our deen that are definitive, and there are things in our deen that are probabilistic. Why? Well, first, because of authenticity, thubut. When you have sacred texts, we know from Hadith 101 and Quran 101 that there are texts that are mutawatir and there are texts that are ahad. For example, a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is transmitted through chains of transmission. And those chains of transmission could be mutawatir, mass transmitted, or they could be ahad, not mass transmitted, solitary. So when a hadith is mass transmitted, its authenticity is definitive. Doesn't leave any doubt. That's by definition, and we've covered that in Hadith 101. But a hadith that is transmitted through an ahad chain of transmission is probabilistic because there is a chance of error. Even a sahih hadith, even a hadith in Bukhari, right? There is a chance of human error. And so we say it is 97% authentic, or 98, or 99%. We're not going to say 100%. That only goes for mutawatir, right? So there is a level of probabilistic concept there. There is a chance of error there. So there is definitive versus probabilistic in thubut. And so if something is being communicated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through a communication that has reached us in a way that is definitive, absolutely authentic, like the Quran, for example, or like the mutawatir hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, and it is demanding something from us in a binding way, the Hanafis would say that action is fard. For example, the performance of Salat al-Fajr or the 5 daily salawats, right? The demand from Allah Azza wa Jal to perform the 5 daily salawats is a binding demand that is communicated through the Quran, which is a mutawatir text. And so its authenticity is definitive. And therefore, the Hanafis will say, performing the 5 daily salawat is fard. Okay? But now, does the Quran talk about Salatul Witr? No. It says, وَالشَّفْعِ وَالْوَتْرِ. That's not Salatul Witr. Okay? That's not talking about Salatul Witr. And it's just taking an oath by wal-watr. It's not saying anything about performing Salatul Witr. Okay? So there is no mention of Salatul Witr in the Quran. Salatul Witr is talked about in the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, is there a demand, a binding demand from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that has been transmitted through a mutawatir text about Salatul Witr? No, there isn't. What is communicated through mutawatir text is that the Prophet ﷺ used to perform witr. But just because he performs something does not make it obligatory. However, there are texts where he demanded from people to perform Salatul Witr. But that demand is communicated through texts that are not mutawatir. They are ahad. And therefore, the Hanafis will say that witr is wajib, not fard. Because the texts about witr are dhanni in their thubut, in their authenticity. They're probabilistic in their authenticity and not definitive, not qat'i, because they're not mutawatir texts. And the same distinction goes for haram and makruh tahrimi. Haram is a prohibition that is discovered through a mutawatir text, either the Quran or through mutawatir sunnah. Whereas makruh tahrimi is something whose prohibition is discovered through a non-mutawatir text. Okay, so for example, we say that it is makruh, tahrimi, to pray nawafil at the time of sunset or at the time of sunrise. Makruh, tahrimi. We don't say haram. Why? It's not in the Quran. The Quran doesn't say don't pray at these times. The Sunnah teaches us don't pray at these times, and the Sunnah that teaches us that is not mutawatir sunnah, it's ahad sunnah. So they say it's makruh tahrimi, not haram. Okay, but eating pork is haram. Why? Because the Quran says so, and the Quran is qat'i in its thubut. But qat'i and dhanni are not just about thubut. They're also about dalala. So there's the concept of qat'i thubut, and there's the concept of qat'i dalala. Qat'i dalala and dhanni dalala means what? That when I have a text in front of me, whether it's the Quran or the Sunnah, how clear is the meaning of that text? is the text stated in such a way that it can only be understood in one way? Or is it possible to understand it in 2 different ways, or 3 different ways, or 4 different ways? If it can only be understood in one way, then it is qat'i in its dalala. It's definitive in its meaning. There is no doubt that this is what it means. For example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when you do certain things, then you have to fast 3 days. Fast 3 days. Can somebody say, well, maybe it means 5? No, 3 means 3. 3 does not mean 1 or 2 or 5. 3, very clear. 3 means 3. That's qat'i. Qat'i. Cannot be understood in any other way. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, says, when a woman is divorced, she must wait for 3 cycles and before she can marry somebody else. And so the waiting period is 3 quru. Now, what is the meaning of quru? We say cycles. But how do you define a cycle? Is it the time when she's bleeding? Or is it the time when she is pure? Or is it both together? Pure plus bleeding is 1 cycle? Which one is it? By consensus, it's not the 3rd one. Some scholars say it is the time when she's bleeding, and some say no, it's the time when she is not bleeding. And the word quru is an Arabic word which can be understood this way or this way. And guess what? It makes a difference. It makes a difference of several days. 5, 6, 7 days. So if we're going to consider that it's the time of bleeding, then that means that her iddah is going to be a certain amount of days. If we're going to say it's going to be the time of purity, it's going to be a different amount of days. And for a woman who's in a hurry to get married to somebody because there's a proposal on the table, it makes a difference. It also makes a difference for the husband because he has to continue to provide for her during the iddah. As soon as the iddah is over, he doesn't have to provide for her. So it also makes a difference for him. Especially if he's already married somebody else and he already has somebody else now that he needs to take care of, right? So the meaning is probabilistic. This is an example of dhanniyud dalala. So if there is an obligation that is being communicated through the Quran even, but through a text that is dhanni in its dalala, then the Hanafis will say it's wajib, it's not fard. And similarly, if there's a prohibition that is being communicated through a text that is dhanni in its dalala, even though it may be qat'i in its thubut, but it's dhanni in its dalala, then the Hanafis will say that this is makruh tahrim, not haram, but makruh tahrim. And then one more thing here, that the Hanafis also, they make a distinction here because the denial of the definitive is kufr, but the denial of the probabilistic is not kufr. So somebody who denies something that is established through qat'i evidence has committed kufr. And that's why somebody who denies that pork is haram has committed kufr. Somebody who denies that homosexual acts are haram, they've committed kufr. Somebody who denies these things is kufr. But somebody who denies something that is established through dhanni text, somebody who denies that witr is wajib, it's not kufr. In fact, the non-Hanafis say that witr is not wajib. They say it's sunnah. Okay? So denial of the probabilistic is not kufr. Denial of the definitive is kufr. And so that's why the Ahnaf have these 7 categories of hukum taklifi. Fard, wajib, you have to do both of them. Both are binding demands from the lawgiver. And the non-performance of both of them is sinful, right? But the difference is one is established through a qat'i text, the other one is established through a dhanni text. And therefore, practically speaking, there's no difference between fard or wajib. Practically speaking, there's no difference. The difference is theologically. If somebody denies that fajr is obligatory, that's kufr. But if somebody denies that witr is required, that's not kufr. Okay? Somebody denies, for example, that, the Hanafis, they say, for example, that not cutting the beard, not shaving the beard is required. Yeah? So they will say that not cutting the beard is wajib. They will not say not cutting the beard is fard. It's wajib, not fard. Right? The Shafi'is say it's sunnah. But the Hanafi say it's fard. Not cutting the beard is fard. Wajib. They will not say it is fard. So somebody who says, no, I don't think that it's required for me to keep a beard, it's not kufr. Because the denial of fard is kufr. Denial of wajib is not kufr. And the same thing here. Denial of haram is kufr. Denial of makruh tahrimi is not kufr. But for practical purposes, there is no difference between makruh tahrimi and haram, because the performance of both is sinful. Doing makruh tahrimi is sinful, and doing haram is sinful. And avoiding haram is rewardable, and avoiding makruh tahrimi is rewardable. All right. So we're done with the Hanafi classification. Now let's talk about the categories of obligation. Or not all obligations are the same. There are different types of obligation. There's something called fard mutlaq and fard muqayyad. There's something called fard muwassa and fard mudayyaq. Fard muhaddad and fard ghayr muhaddad. Fard muayyan, fard mukhayyar. And fard ayn and fard kifaya. The last one is the most commonly known one, right? So let's start with that one. Something can be an individual obligation or a communal obligation. An example of individual obligation is what? Huh? 5 daily prayers. What else? Huh? Fasting the month of Ramadan, learning to recite the Quran, for example, right? An example of communal obligation is what? Fard kifaya. Huh? I'tikaf is not fard. I'tikaf is not fard, huh? Salatul janaza is fard kifaya. Correct. What else? Salatul Eid is not fard, according to anybody, not even the Ahnaf. Salatul Eid is not fard. They may say it's wajib, maybe. I'm not sure. Maybe they say it's wajib. They don't say it's fard. Okay? So remember, we just talked about the difference between fard and wajib. So what's an example of fard kifaya? Huh? Having a scholar in the community. Good. That's correct. Having a scholar in the community. Fard kifaya. Al-amru bil-ma'ruf wa-nahyu anil munkar. Commanding good and forbidding evil. Fard kifaya. Commanding good and forbidding evil. There's an evil that's happening. Somebody has to speak out against it. Somebody has to. Fard kifaya. Okay. All right. Now, so this is well known. Fard ayn and fard kifaya. Let's talk about the other ones. Fard mutlaq and fard muqayyad. Okay. there are obligations that are unrestricted, meaning what? That there is no restriction that they have to be performed at a specific time. They have to be performed, but there's no specified time in which they have to be performed. Who can give me an example of an obligation like that? Huh?
Hajj.
No, Hajj can only be performed at a, can we perform Hajj right now? We cannot. So that is not unrestricted, that is restricted. Huh? Umrah. Is Umrah fard? According to the Shafi'is, yes. According to the Hanafis, no. Okay? So if we go with the Shafi'i opinion that Umrah is also fard, like Hajj, right? Now, if we go with that opinion, because of the ayah, وَأَتِمُّ الْحَجَّ وَالْعُمْرَةَ لِلَّهِ, command from Allah Azza wa Jal. So now, if we say that Umrah is fard, and that's what the Shafi'is say, do you think it is unrestricted? It can be performed at any time? What do you think? Obviously, Umrah can be performed at any time. So this would be a good example of an unrestricted obligation, fard mutlaq. Another example of unrestricted obligation. Don't just think about worship, think about other things too. Okay, zakat, good. Zakat, does it have to be given in Ramadan? No, contrary to what a lot of people think, right? Zakat can be given at any time, right? So it's fard mutlaq. What about kindness to parents? Is that fard? Yes. That's what I was saying. Don't just think about worship. Kindness to parents, fard. Is there a time frame for that? No, anytime. Fard mutlaq. All right. Now we have fard muqayyad. Now fard muqayyad is of two types. Fard muqayyad is of two types: widened and constricted, muwassa' and mudayyaq. In other words, there is a restricted time frame, but that time frame can be constricted or can be widened. In other words, you can have a time, a window of time, which is widened, or no, there's a specific time and there is no room at all. It has to be performed at that specific time. So that's muwassa' and mudayyaq. Okay, so what's an example of fard muwassa'? Something that's obligatory and it has to be performed at a specific time, but there is a window of time, not a moment of time, huh? Hajj. What do you think? Hajj. Is there a window of time or is there a specific time it has to be performed? Arafah. Can I do Arafah on the 9th or the 10th or the 11th? No, it has to be on the 9th exactly. So it is mudayyaq. Hajj is mudayyaq. An example of muwassa' is what? Prayer. 5 daily salawat. Right? Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, Fajr. There's a window of time. I don't have to pray at dawn. I have all the way until sunrise to pray my Fajr. Okay? So that's fard muwassa'. What about the fast of Ramadan? Huh? Mudayyaq. It is constricted. Has to be done in Ramadan. Cannot be done outside of Ramadan. All right. Now we have fard muhaddad and fard ghayr muhaddad. Fard muhaddad are quantified obligations where there's an obligation and there's a specific quantity that is required. And if I don't do that quantity, then it becomes a debt on me until I fulfill that quantity. What's an example of a quantified obligation? Okay, zakat is a good example, right? Zakat, when I calculate my zakat, there's an exact amount that I have to pay. If I pay less than that, it's a debt. I have to pay it. Okay. Now, we're talking about the regular zakat. What about zakat al-fitr? Is it a quantified obligation? Yes, it is. That's also an obligation. Zakat al-Fitr is also an obligation, and it's a quantified obligation. Okay? Mahr. Mahr, right? The bride and the groom, they agree on a specific amount. A specific amount. Let's say $5,000. And then the groom, he pays her 4,000. Has he fulfilled the obligation? No. It has to be 5,000. Not 49.99. 5,000. Otherwise, that $1 is a debt on him, right? Because this is fard muhaddad. Okay. Now, an example of fard that is غير muhaddad is when, for example, let's say that there are, I have some needy relatives. I have some relatives that are masakin, that are needy. Is it required for me, and I am an affluent person, alhamdulillah, I have extra wealth. Is it required for me to spend on my relatives? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Is there a specific amount I have to spend? So that's wajib غير muhaddad. Wajib غير muhaddad. And wajib غير muhaddad, let's say I don't fulfill my obligation. I have a needy relative. They were needy for a whole year. And I had extra wealth and I turned the other way. I ignored them. I'm sinful for that. Now, is there a debt on me that I have to pay? No. So it's wajib غير muhaddad. If I don't fulfill the obligation, I just need to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there's no debt on me. But with wajib muhaddad, if let's say I didn't pay zakat from last year, I need to repent from Allah for Allah Azza wa Jal, and it's a debt on me. I have to pay it. I can't say, well, the year is gone now. Zakat al-Fitr from last year, I didn't pay, it's gone now. No, it's a debt on me. So when there is a fard muhaddad, it becomes a debt. When there is fard ghayr muhaddad, there is no debt. That raises a question. The husband, does he have to spend on the wife? Does he have to spend on the wife? Yes. Is it muhaddad or ghayr muhaddad? The scholars have disagreed about this. The Hanafi school says it's ghayr muhaddad. There's no specific amount. But the Shafi'i say it's muhaddad. There is a minimum amount that is required. And that amount varies depending on whether the husband is poor or rich. There's an amount for the poor and there's an amount for the rich. But the amount is specified. A minimum amount is specified. And so, if we go with the Shafi'i opinion that it is fard muhaddad, and let's say husband and wife were in conflict for a whole year, the husband didn't provide for the wife, and the wife takes him to court. Can the court say to the husband, you must pay for the last year? Yes. But if it's a Hanafi court, it's a Hanafi court. No. Because there's no debt, because it's not muhaddad. It's غير muhaddad. You see? So they might punish the husband in some other ways for not fulfilling the obligation, but there's no debt because there was no specified, quantified amount. All right. Let's go to wajib muayyan and wajib mukhayyar, the last one. Specified and unspecified. Specified obligation is something very specific is obligatory, whereas an unspecified obligation is where you are given a choice. You may do this or this or this, but you have to do one of these. What's an example of an unspecified obligation? Somewhere where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or his messenger, they tell us you have to do one of these options. Good. Breaking an oath. When I break an oath, when I say, Wallahi, I'm going to do this, and then I don't, I swear by Allah, I didn't do this, and I actually did, that's breaking an oath, right? When I break an oath, I have to atone for that. It's called kafaratul yameen. I have to atone for that. There's an obligation to do kafara. There's an obligation to do an atonement. Tayyib, what do I have to do? What is obligatory for me to do? How do I atone for breaking an oath? What do I have to do? Suratul Ma'idah, ayah number 89. You have to do what? Free a slave or feed 10 needy people, or no, or what's the third option? Huh? No. What's the third option? Clothe 10 needy people. Okay? Free a slave, or it'am, feed 10 needy people, or kiswa, clothe 10 needy people. If none of them are possible, then I may do what? Fast 3 days. But I don't jump to fasting 3 days unless none of these three are possible. So this is an example of an unspecified obligation. Unspecified in the sense that I may do this or this or this. I have options. I may clothe 10 needy people, or feed 10 needy people, or free a slave. Most of the obligations are not unspecified. Most of the obligations are specified, such as fasting Ramadan. I must fast Ramadan. I don't have the option to do Ramadan or Rajab or Rabiul Awwal. No, it has to be Ramadan. So these are the different types of fard, or different types of obligation, different categories of obligation. Now, different categories of recommendation. There is the concept, of course, of sunnah mu'akkada and sunnah ghayr mu'akkada. Okay? So when it comes to salah, what's an example of sunnah mu'akkada? When it comes to salah, what's an example of sunnah mu'akkada? Sunnah of Fajr, which is how many rak'ah? 2 rak'ah when? Before Fajr. Okay? 2 rak'ah before Fajr, an example of sunnah mu'akkada. Also, for the non-Hanafis, an example of sunnah mu'akkada is what? Mm-mm. Hmm? Mm-mm. That's all غير مؤكدة. Hmm? No. I mentioned it earlier. Witr, there you go. Witr, right? Witr for the non-Hanafis, sunnah mu'akkada, not wajib. Sunnah mu'akkada. In fact, for the Shafi'is say that the most emphasized sunnah prayer is witr. So they're just a little below the Hanafis. But it's a big difference. Between wajib and sunnah, it's a huge difference. Because if you don't do it, you are not punishable. Okay? All right. The non-emphasized غير مؤكدة sunnah, what's an example of that? What's an example of sunnah غير مؤكدة? 4 rak'ah before Asr prayer. Excellent. What else? For the non-Hanafis. We mentioned it earlier. For the non-Hanafis, an example of Sunnah غير مؤكدة. 2 rak'ah before Maghrib. 2 rak'ah before Maghrib. All right. The Hanafis say don't pray anything before Maghrib, right? But for the non-Hanafis, because of that hadith that I mentioned, they say it's sunnah, but it's غير مؤكدة. Okay. Categories of prohibition. What time are we going to? 12:15. Okay. Categories of prohibition. There are things that are haram lidatihi, and there are things that are haram lighayrihi. Things that are prohibited in and of themselves, haram lidatihi. And there are things that are not haram in and of themselves. In and of themselves, actually, they are halal. But because of something else, they become haram. Because of something else, they become haram. In and of themselves, they're not haram. Okay? And so naturally, something that is haram li ghayrihi, haram li dhatihi, intrinsically prohibited, is more serious than something that is haram li ghayrihi, because in and of itself, it is not haram. But they are both haram. It's just that the level is not the same. Kind of like major sins and minor sins. Major sins are more serious. Minor sins are not as serious, even though they are both sins. Both have to be avoided. So there is a level, a degree of a difference here between something that is haram li dhatihi and something that's haram li ghayrihi. So an example of something that is haram li dhatihi is zina, fornication, or adultery. Somebody to marry a mahram, get married to their sister, for example, their daughter, for example. Haram li dhatihi. Eating carrion, eating unslaughtered dead meat. Haram li dhatihi. Theft, murder, etc. These are haram li dhati. But haram li ghayrihi, haram li ghayrihi, an example of that is performing salah on property that is confiscated. For example, let's say that my mother passes away and she wrote a wasiyah. She left behind a wasiyah, according to which she had a property that she owned and she gave that away to, let's say, my cousin. But after she dies, I take that property and I start living in there and I don't give it to my cousin. My salah in that property is haram, because I cannot make use of that property at all. It's not mine, it's my cousin's. But I have confiscated that property from my cousin. And so for me to perform salah in that home is haram. But it's haram li ghayrihi. Salah in and of itself is not haram, but it's becoming haram because I'm performing it in a place where I am not allowed to be. So that's haram li ghayrihi. Now, whether or not that salah is valid or do I have to repeat that salah, that's a different story. We're going to come to that later when we talk about hukum wad'i. Okay? But that salah is haram, meaning that I am not getting reward for that salah. I'm being punished for that salah. I'm being punished for that salah. Okay? According to many scholars, I don't have to repeat the salah. It's valid. But according to some, it has to be repeated, as we will see, inshallah. Commercial transactions after the adhan of Jumu'ah. For me to buy and sell something after the adhan of Jumu'ah is haram. For me to do shopping on Amazon during the khutbah. Do people do that, by the way? Unfortunately. Yeah. For me to shop on Amazon during the khutbah is haram. Shopping on Amazon is not haram, but it becomes haram. It's haram li ghayri, because I'm doing it after the adhan of Jum'ah. Haram li ghayri. For somebody to get married to, let's say, a woman, man gets married to a woman with an agreement that he will divorce her after a week so that she can remarry her ex-husband. A divorced woman who was divorced by her husband 3 times cannot remarry her ex-husband unless she marries somebody else and also gets divorced from them. So for me, or for a man to marry a woman with this agreement that we'll just stay married for a week and then we'll get divorced so that she can remarry her ex-husband, this is a marriage that is haram. But it's haram li ghayrihi. Not in and of itself is not haram. They're not mahram for one another. They can get married. But this agreement makes it a marriage that is haram li ghayrihi. Now, is the marriage valid or not? Again, that's a different story. We'll come to that. Haram li ghayrihi also is divorce during menstruation. It is not allowed for the husband to divorce his wife during her menses. It's not allowed. But it's haram li ghayrihi. Divorce in and of itself is not haram. But because she's in her menses, it becomes haram. Now, does the divorce take place or not? That's a different story again, right? But the act is haram. The husband is sinful, punished by Allah Azza wa Jal for that. Okay? So these are all haram li ghayrihi. Now, what is the consequence of the distinction between haram li dhatihi and haram li ghayrihi? There are a number of consequences. Consequence number 1. An action that is haram li dhatihi is not just haram, it's also invalid. So when a man marries his daughter, for example, or a man marries a woman who he's related to by milk, that marriage is haram and it's also invalid. In other words, that marriage does not take place. Does not take place. Okay? A Muslim woman marries a non-Muslim man. That marriage is not just haram. It is invalid because it's haram li dhati. Okay? Haram li dhatihi. So actions that are haram li dhatihi are not just prohibited, they are also invalid. As for actions that are haram li ghayrihi, they are haram, but according to some of the ulama, they are valid. Valid. So salah on confiscated property does not need to be repeated because it was valid. An Amazon transaction does not need to be returned. The item does not need to be returned because the sale is valid. A marriage with the agreement of divorce to make a woman halal for her ex-husband, the marriage itself is valid, even though it's haram. Divorce during menstruation occurs, even though it's haram, because these are all haram li ghayrihi. according to some of the ulama, haram li ghayrihi is valid. Whereas haram li dhatihi is always invalid according to everybody. So that's one distinction between, or one consequence of the distinction between haram li dhatihi and haram li ghayrihi. The second consequence of this distinction is that haram li dhatihi can only become permissible when there is darura. The concept of darura, necessity, that we'll talk more about when we talk about maqasid al-sharia tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. But for now, everybody understands that sometimes some things become necessary. The concept of necessity. If I don't do haram, I will die. Somebody who is dying from hunger. Dying from hunger. And the only thing that they have available to eat is something that is haram, like dead meat. Right? Somebody is stranded in a desert and they have nothing to eat, and they come across a dead carcass, dead animal, and they're dying from hunger. Can they eat from that animal's meat? Yes, it becomes halal. Even though we said that dead, unslaughtered meat is haram li dhatihi. So haram li dhatihi becomes halal, but it only becomes halal when there's a necessity. And how is necessity defined? A necessity is defined as when you are in a situation when not doing haram will cost you a limb or life. Will cost you a limb or life. That's a necessity. Something without which life is not possible. That's a necessity. Something without which life is not possible. Now, a necessity is different from a need. Necessity is darura. Need is haja. Darura, haja. Necessity, need. Needs are those things without which life is difficult. Very difficult, but not impossible. Okay? Life is difficult, but not impossible. And then, so the question is that if something that is prohibited is a need, but not a necessity, does that make the haram halal? And the answer is that something that is haram li dhatihi can only become permissible when there's a necessity. But something that is haram li ghayrihi can become permissible when there is a communal need. When something becomes a need of the society. In other words, it's difficult for people in general to live without this thing, then that haram becomes halal. If that haram is haram li ghayrihi. Okay? So this is very theoretical. I'll give you a practical example of this. Before we had these Islamic financing firms a couple of decades ago, the only way that you could buy a home in the United States was either if you put cash down or take on a mortgage. and pay interest. Pay interest, right? So 20 years ago, 30 years ago, buying a home, the scholars, they did a study and they concluded that buying a home for the Muslim community in the United States is a need. It's a communal need. As a whole, the Muslim community needs to buy homes. Why? Well, because Muslims, alhamdulillah, have large families. 4 children, 5 children, 6 children. They can't find apartments to live in. And they cannot afford to rent houses. So it becomes a communal need to purchase a home. Also, when you rent, your money is just, it's not building any equity. And it's important for Muslims as a community to build equity to establish themselves in the fabric of society here. So they concluded that buying homes is a need. It's not a necessity. You're not going to die. But it's a need of the Muslim community. Now, paying interest is different from receiving interest. Consuming riba and giving riba are not the same. They're both haram. But consuming riba is haram lidhatihi. Whereas paying riba is haram lighayrihi. Haram lighayrihi. And so we said that something that is haram lighayrihi can become permissible when there's a communal need. Something that is haram li dhatihi can only become permissible when there is a what? Necessity, darura, necessity, right? And based on this analysis, many of the ulama in the 90s, some big names, many of the ulama, they issued a fatwa. In fact, as a council of ulama, they issued a fatwa that for the Muslim community in the United States, it is permissible to purchase a home on a bank loan. Permissible. Although they said it's better to avoid it, but it is permissible because of this analysis. Okay? I'm just giving that as a practical example of this theoretical concept, that the distinction between haram li dhatihi and haram li ghayrihi is important for this reason as well. Because haram li dhatihi can only become halal in the case of necessity, whereas haram li ghayrihi becomes halal in the case of necessity and also when there is a communal need. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now the categories of dislike. There is makruh and there is khilaful awla. Makruh is explicitly disliked and khilaful awla is implicitly disliked. So khilaful awla is a non-binding demand to do something which implies that doing the opposite would be disliked. So an example of makruh is, for example, sitting down in the masjid without praying 2 rak'ah. Entering the masjid and then sitting down without praying 2 rak'ah. This is makruh. This is explicitly disliked. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ explicitly said, don't do that. Don't sit down after entering the masjid before you perform 2 rak'ah. So there is an explicit demand from Rasulullah ﷺ not to do that. Drinking while standing. The Prophet ﷺ explicitly said, don't do that. Okay? But an example of khilaful awla is, for example, not praying the duha prayer. It's disliked, but it's implicitly disliked because the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to pray duha. So not doing what he encouraged us to do would not be makruh. It would be khilaful awla. Another example of khilaf al-awla would be to skip a Ramadan fast while on a journey when I have no hardship. Okay, I'm traveling, I don't have any hardship to fast, but I still choose not to fast. This is not makruh because there's no prohibition against that. But it is khilaful awla because Allah says, وَأَن تَصُومُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. If you fast, it is better for you. So for me, not to fast is disliked, but it's khilaful awla. And so khilaful awla is a category between makruh and mubah. Between makruh and mubah. Makruh is explicit. Don't do this. Don't sit down in the masjid before you perform 2 rak'ah. Don't drink while you stand. There's no text that says, don't omit your fast while you're traveling. There's no text like that. But the opposite one, tasumu khayr, it's better for you to fast, and then I still choose not to fast, that's khilaful awla. So it's between makruh and mubah. We're done with hukum taklifi, alhamdulillah. Let's go on to hukum wad'i. We have about 6 minutes left. Remember, hukum shar'i is of 2 types, al-hukum taklifi and al-hukum al-wad'i, right? So, al-hukum is defined as God's proclamation regarding the action of someone who is legally responsible by way of a demand, permission, or declaration. We've talked about demands and permission. Let's now talk about declaration. So, al-hukum al-wad'i is 7 things. السبب, الشرط, المانع, الصحة, البطلان, العزيمة, and الرخصة. Cause, prerequisite, hindrance, validity, invalidity, original law, and concession. Let's talk about sabab first, a cause. A cause is an attribute that is evident and constant, which the lawgiver has tagged as the indicator of a hukum in such a way that its presence necessitates the presence of the hukum, and its absence means that the hukum is also absent. An attribute that is evident, zahir, and constant, which the lawgiver has tagged as the indicator of a hukum in such a way that the presence of this attribute necessitates the presence of this hukum. And the absence of the attribute means that the hukum is also absent. An example: the break of dawn is the cause for the obligation of Fajr prayer. The break of dawn is the cause for the obligation of Fajr prayer. Now let's see how this definition applies here. The break of dawn is an attribute that is evident, right? The break of dawn is something that is evident. All you have to do is you have to go up to a place from which you can see the horizon, okay, which nowadays is difficult because of all these tall structures. But in the old days, when the structures were low, right, and it's even until now in certain parts of the world, right, you go to the roof or just a high place where you can see the eastern horizon and the break of dawn. It's evident. You see it with your eyes. You don't need a telescope or binoculars to do that. Just see it with the eyes. Okay? It's evident. And it's constant, meaning the break of dawn is something that looks the same, whether it's Africa or Asia or Europe, right? Which the lawgiver has tagged as the indicator of the obligation of Fajr prayer in such a way that the presence of the break of dawn necessitates the obligation of Fajr prayer. And the absence of dawn necessitates that the Fajr prayer is not obligatory yet. Okay, so when dawn breaks, Fajr becomes obligatory. When dawn does not break, Fajr does not become obligatory. That relationship is the relationship of cause and effect, sabab, and the effect of the sabab. Okay? Dawn is there, Fajr becomes obligatory. Dawn is not there, Fajr does not become obligatory. So can you pray Fajr before dawn? Can you? No, because it has not come into existence. The obligation has not come into existence. The hukum is not there. So what is it that I'm performing when it's not even there? People ask me, like, can I pray Fajr before it's time? No, I cannot. It has not come into existence yet because the sabab is not there. The sabab, God, the lawgiver has said, Fajr only becomes obligatory once this happens. Okay. Sabab and hukum. Possession of nisab. We have 1 minute left. Okay. Possession of nisab is the sabab for the obligation of zakat. What's nisab? Nisab is the minimum amount of wealth that I have to own for a year in order for me to be required to pay zakat. Okay. Nowadays, it's, I think, around a few $1,000s. Does anybody know? It's around 5,000? Around $5,000, the nisab for gold. Okay. So possession of nisab. Once I possess the nisab, zakat becomes obligatory for me. If I don't own the nisab, zakat is not obligatory on me. So this is the sabab and that is the hukum. Theft is the sabab for the obligation of corporal punishment. If somebody commits theft and it is proven, then it becomes obligatory to apply the corporal punishment. If it is not proven that somebody has committed theft, there is no obligation to apply the corporal punishment. Travel. Travel is the sabab for the permission of breaking the fast. If somebody is on a journey, it is permitted for them to break their fast. If somebody is not on a journey, well, then it is not permissible for them to break their fast. Marriage is the sabab for the prohibition of further marriages. If somebody is married, then, like for a woman, for example, if a woman is married, then it is prohibited for her to marry anybody else. If a man is married to 4 women, it is prohibited for him to marry another woman. This is the sabab, this is the hukum. So this is the relationship of sabab and hukum. Okay, in the next slide, we see that there are different types of cause. There are causes that are within the control of the mukallaf, and there are causes that are not within the control of the mukallaf. So you go back here and you see, for example, is the break of dawn within my control? No. Possession of nisab, is that within my control? To a certain extent, yes. Not always. The rizq is from Allah Azza wa Jal, but I can make an effort. Is theft within my control? Yes. Is travel within my control? Yes. Is marriage within my control? Yes. So there are certain causes that are within the control of the mukallaf and certain ones that are not. And then certain causes are related to the hukum in a way that makes sense. And there are causes that are not related to a hukum in any way that makes rational, logical sense. So is there a logical relationship between the break of dawn and the obligation of prayer? Is there a logical connection between the two? No. No. Allah could have made prayer obligatory at the time of sunrise. Right? It would be just as much of, there's no logical connection there. Is there a logical connection between theft and corporal punishment? Yes. Theft is harmful for society, and so it makes sense to have punishment for that. Okay? So Sometimes the relationship is logical, sometimes it's not something that makes logical sense. Okay, and depending on what type of cause we are talking about, there are different terms that are used that we're going to talk about, inshallah, after the break. So let's take our second break, inshallah. It's 12:18. Let's resume at 12:30, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. So we are talking about al-hukum al-shar'i, and we said that there are two types of al-hukum shar'i. There's al-hukum al-taklifi and al-hukum al-wad'i, defining law and declaratory law. And we already talked about al-hukum al-taklifi, and we said that according to the classification of the Hanafis, they classify hukum taklifi into how many types? 7. And the non-Hanafis, they have how many? 5. Correct. And then we talked about the different categories of obligation and recommendation and prohibition as well as dislike. And then we started talking about al-hukum al-wad'i. And we said there are how many types of al-hukum al-wad'i? 7. And the first of them is cause, sabab. Now we said there's different types of sabab. There is this type of cause that is within the control of the mukallaf, and there is that which is not within the control of the mukallaf. And then there is a cause that is related to the hukum in a way that makes sense, and cause that is not related to the hukum in a way that makes sense. Now, there are some terms that are related to sabab that we need to talk about. And those terms are illah and hikmah, rationale and wisdom. Rationale and wisdom. So first of all, sabab and illah are two terms that most of the ulama use interchangeably. Okay, so sabab and illah are interchangeable, synonymous terms in the usage of the majority of the ulama. However, the Hanafis use them in a different way. Okay, so in the Hanafi usage of the term, a sabab is not the same as an illah, even though they are related. So what is the Hanafi usage? They say that an illah is a sabab that is rationalizable. Okay, whereas a sabab is not rationalizable. Okay, so when we said here that there are different types of cause, and we says there's a cause that is related to the hukum in a way that makes sense, the Hanafis would not call this a sabab, they would call it an illah. They would call it an illah. As for a cause that is not related to the hukum in a way that makes sense, they would not call this an illah, they would call this a sabab. Okay, or to be more accurate, actually, the Hanafis would call both of these sabab, but they would call this one an illah as well. They would not call this an illah. An illah is related to the hukum in a way that makes sense. A sabab is generally not related to the hukum that makes sense, but it may also be. So every illah is a sabab, but not every sabab is an illah, according to the Hanafis. An illah is a cause that is related to the hukum in a way that makes sense. And so if we go back here, the break of dawn is a sabab for the obligation of Fajr prayer. But it is not an illah for the obligation of Fajr prayer. Whereas travel, for example, is an illah for the permission of breaking fast, because the relationship makes sense. When you travel, you tend to have hardship, and it makes sense that the lawgiver permits you to break the fast during travel. That relationship makes sense. So they say travel is the illah for the permission of breaking the fast. Okay, but the break of dawn is not the illah for the obligation of Fajr prayer, because this relationship is not rationalizable. So they will say this is the sabab for the obligation of Fajr prayer. So this is the Hanafi usage of sabab and illah. So is the sabab the same thing as illah, or are they different? According to the majority of the scholars, they are the same thing. Okay, so the majority would say that the break of dawn is a sabab as well as the illah for the obligation of Fajr prayer, because they don't have that distinction between rationalizable and non-rationalizable. But the Hanafis would make a distinction. As for hikmah, wisdom is something that is different from cause and rationale. Okay, according to everybody. What's the difference? Wisdom or hikmah is not always evident, and it's not always a constant. Whereas a cause, by definition, we said that it is an attribute that is both evident and constant, right? It was right here. An attribute that is evident and constant. But hikmah does not have to be evident, and it does not have to be constant. And since it is not evident and not constant, it has no impact on law, according to the majority of scholars. Hikmah has no impact on law, according to most of the scholars. What has an impact on law is sabab. What's an example of that? An example, we said that travel is a sabab for the permission to break the fast, right? Well, what is the hikmah behind the permission to break the fast while traveling? The hikmah is hardship. Okay, the reason, the hikmah, the wisdom behind the lawgiver allowing us to break our fast when we travel is because when we travel, we have the potential to face hardship. That's why, that's the wisdom behind the permission to break the fast. But here's the question: is hardship something that is evident and constant? The answer is no. Hardship is not quantifiable. Travel is, you can say 48 miles. You can say 3 days, 14 days. These are quantities. These are quantifiable things. Hardship is very subjective. Very subjective. When I travel from here to New York in a plane, am I experiencing hardship? Somebody might say yes, somebody might say no. It's subjective, right? It's subjective. And so hardship is not evident, and it's not constant either. On the same trip, my wife can actually feel hardship because she gets motion sick while I am enjoying being served by the flight attendants, right? I'm enjoying my trip, right? So it's not constant, but we are both traveling. That's constant. We are both going more than 48 miles. We are both going for 4 days. That's a constant. That's not different. So what impacts law is sabab and not hikmah. And that's why it doesn't matter whether I'm experiencing hardship or not. The fact that the sabab is there, which is travel, gives me the permission to break the fast. It is sabab that impacts law, not hikmah. Even though we say that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made this the sabab for this is because of this hikmah. Yes, there's hikmah, there's wisdom behind that, but we don't look at the hikmah to pronounce a hukum. A hukum is attached to the sabab, which is quantifiable, not to hikmah, which is obscure and unquantifiable. So let's ask a question. Why are women required to cover in front of men? Women are required to cover in front of men. Why? Who can tell me why? Why are women required to cover in front of men? Who can tell me? Yes. Yeah, but the question is, why does Allah prescribe so? Why did Allah prescribe women to cover in front of men? Why? Modesty? Mm-hmm. What is the wisdom? What is the wisdom for Allah asking women to cover in front of men? Yes. Right? Allah says, so that they are not harmed. To protect them from fitna. To protect them from fitna and to protect them from harm. Now, are these things measurable? Is fitna measurable? Protection from harm, is it measurable? No. What is measurable is this man your mahram or not? Is that something that's obscure or evident? That's evident. Is this your brother? Is this your father? Is this your cousin? These are evident. And therefore, the law is going to be based on a sabab. If he's not your mahram, you have to cover. If he's your mahram, you don't have to cover. Whether or not you're going to be harmed and there's going to be fitna, that's the hikmah behind it. But we don't base law on that. And that's why no woman can come and say, oh, but I view him just like my brother. He's just like a brother to me. We grew up in the same home. He's my cousin, but he's like a brother to me. Why do I have to cover in front of him? Oh, he's 20 years younger than me. I don't feel any harm. We don't look at each other in that way. These are all things that are not constant. It may be the case with you. It's not the case with another family. So laws are connected to things that are constant and evident. Asbab. The sabab here is he's not your mahram, therefore you have to cover. And you know what? We do the same thing in secular law. The same thing in secular law. Why do you have to stop at a red light? Why? Why do you have to stop at a red light? Huh? For safety. So that there's no crashes that take place. That's the hikmah. But now at 3 a.m., when there are no cars on McDermott Avenue, and you come to a red light, do you have to stop? But it's completely safe for me to go. Doesn't matter. The law is connected to the red light, even though the wisdom behind it is the safety of people. But the law has to be connected to something that is evident, something that is measurable. Safety is not measurable. Red light is evident and measurable. So the law is whenever there is a red light, I don't care how many cars there are on the road, there's a red light, you stop. If there's a green light, you go. If he's a mahram, you don't cover. If it's not a mahram, you cover. It doesn't matter whether you feel fitna or not. If it's a mahram, you don't lower the gaze. If it is a non-mahram, you lower the gaze. That's it. So, laws are based on asbab. They are not based on hikam. Laws are based on asbab. They are not based on hikam. All right, prerequisite, shart. The next hukum wadi. An attribute whose absence necessitates the absence of the hukum, but its presence does not necessitate the presence of the hukum. Now, this is different from sabab because a sabab was an attribute whose absence necessitates the absence of the hukum and its presence necessitates the presence of the hukum. But here, its presence does not necessitate the presence of the hukum. Examples. Taklif is a shart for all obligations. Okay, I have to be alive, I have to be sane, I have to be all those things for things to become obligatory on me. So now, if I am alive and I am sane, does that mean that I have to give zakat? Somebody who is a mukallaf. Somebody who is a mukallaf. All of you are mukallaf, mashallah. Do you have to pray Maghrib right now? Right now, you have to pray Maghrib? No, you don't. So the presence of it does not necessitate the presence of the hukum. You being a mukallaf does not require that you have to pray Maghrib right now. Because taklif is a shart for the obligation of Maghrib. It's not a sabab. In other words, when the sun sets, which is the sabab for Maghrib, Maghrib will only become obligatory on you if you are a mukallaf. But the fact that you are a mukallaf does not mean that Maghrib is necessarily obligatory on you. No, you have to wait for the sabab. But the sabab is not like that. Sabab, whenever the sabab is there, the obligation is there. When the sun sets, you have to pray. But you have taklif doesn't mean that you have to pray. It's not time for prayer yet. Another example, passage of the lunar year. Passage of the lunar year is a shart for the obligation of zakat. If a lunar year passes, I don't have to give zakat if the sabab is not there, which is the possession of nisab. But if I have the nisab, zakat will not be obligatory on me unless a lunar year has passed on that nisab. That's what it makes it a shart. Another example is purification. Purification is a shart for the validity of salah and tawaf. So if I have tahara, does that mean that my that I have to perform salah? If I have tahara, does that mean I have to perform salah? No. But salah is not going to be valid unless I have tahara. Tawaf is not going to be valid unless I have tahara. So the presence of purification does not necessitate the presence of the hukum. In order for tawaf to be valid, just because I have purification does not mean my tawaf is valid. There has to be many other things that have to be met as well. Okay? Marriage is a shart for the validity of divorce. I can't say to a woman that you are divorced and I'm not even married to her yet. Let's say that, I'm engaged to a girl and I'm talking to her and I get into an argument with her. And I say to her, you're divorced even from now. You're divorced even from now. Like, I don't want to marry you so bad that you're divorced even from now. And then 2 days later, I feel bad about what I said. Can we still get married? Are we going to be divorced immediately after we're married? No, because the shart for the validity of divorce is marriage. I wasn't married when I pronounced divorce on her. And the stolen amount has to be greater than a specific quantity in order for the obligation of the corporal punishment. So if somebody commits theft, but the amount that they have stolen is just like a quarter, then you don't cut off their hands. You cannot cut off their hands. It has to be a significant amount that they have stolen in order for the corporal punishment to become obligatory. So these are examples of a shart. Now, what is the difference between a shart and a rukn? Prerequisite and an integral. A prerequisite is external to the action, whereas an integral is part of the action. A prerequisite is external to the action, whereas an integral is, an integral is part of the action. Both are required for the action to be valid or to be required. Who can give me an example of something that is external to an action? Something that is required for something else, but it is external to it. Yeah? Huh? To be a mukallaf, to be required to pray. Okay, very good. For somebody, for example, to be alive, or to be sane, or to be above the age of puberty, these are things that are external to the prayer. So these are shurut. These are prerequisites for the obligation of prayer. What's another example of something that's external to the action? Yes. Wudu. Okay. Being in a state of tahara. Being in a state of tahara is a shart for the validity of salah, and it's a shart, not a rukn, because it is something external to salah. It's not part of the salah. Wudu is separate from the salah. It's a separate action. Now, what's an example of something that is part of the action? Yes? Okay, good. Niyyah of wudu. Niyyah is part of wudu. It's part of wudu. So it is a rukn of wudu. Okay, what else? What's another example of something that is part of an action? Okay, so sujood. Yeah, sujood. Right, exactly. So we're trying to give examples of arkan. Rukn, the plural of rukn is arkan. So a rukn of salah is sujood. Right? Without sujood, is your prayer valid? No. Without wudu, is your prayer valid? No. But what's the difference between wudu and sujood? Wudu is a shart. Sujood is a rukn. What makes that one a shart and this one a rukn? Because wudu is outside of salah, external to salah. Whereas sujood, is it outside of salah? No, it is part of salah. So we don't call it a shart, we call it a rukn. So that's the difference between a prerequisite and an integral. And the ulama use these terms all the time. Shurut and arkan. Facing the qibla is a what for the validity of the prayer? Facing the qibla. It's a shart for the validity of the prayer. Ruku' is what? Rukn for the validity of prayer. Okay. Making sure that my clothes have no najasa on it is a what for the validity of the prayer? Shart for the validity of the prayer. Whereas For example, sitting in tashahud, in the final tashahud, is what? Rukn for the validity of prayer. Shart versus rukn. Sometimes ulama may differ about something being a shart or a rukn. And an example of that is niyyah. Is niyyah a shart or a rukn? Scholars differ. Some look at it as being part of the prayer, part of the action, like the Shafi'is. So they say it's a rukn of prayer. Others say no, it's external to it. The niyyah has to be there before you say Allahu Akbar. So it's external to it. So they call it a shart versus a rukn. All right, let's go on to mani', hindrance. Mani'. An attribute that is evident and constant, which the lawgiver has attached to a hukum in such a way that its presence necessitates the absence of the hukum or its sabab. Okay, so when the mani' is there, then the hukum is absent. It prevents the hukum from becoming effective. The sabab may be there, the shart may be there, but the mani' comes and it prevents, it's a hindrance. It prevents from the hukum or the sabab of the hukum from taking effect. Examples, the sister was asking me earlier, you know, we said that kindness to parents is an obligation. Kindness to parents is an obligation, and the shart for that is taklif. I have to be a mukallaf. Okay? I have to be a mukallaf in order for that obligation to be there. طيب. But let's say that somebody is unable to be kind to their parents. For example, let's say their parents are sick and they need help. But I am traveling, I'm out of the country. I'm unable to go back in time to take care of them. I'm unable to find somebody to take care of them. I'm unable because of my distance. طيب, that distance, that travel creates a hindrance from that obligation to take effect. So it is no longer obligatory for me to take care of them because of the hindrance of the distance that separates me from my mother, for example. Okay, so that's a mania, that's a hindrance. A woman who is a mukallaf and the sun has set, the sun has set. Prayer is supposed to become obligatory on that woman. But now suppose that she is menstruating. She's menstruating. So her menstruation produces a hindrance for the prayer to become obligatory on her. Produces a hindrance from the prayer becoming obligatory on her. So this is an example of something that hinders the hukum, not the sabab. In this case, it's not the sabab that is being hindered. No, the sun is going to set. Whether she's menstruating or not, that's not going to prevent the sun from setting, right? But the hukum will be hindered because of her menstruation. Another example is debt. Debt is a hindrance for the obligation of zakat. So I possess the nisab, and a year has passed on that nisab. But guess what? I owe this money to somebody else and it is due right now. Okay, let's say that I had borrowed $10,000 from you a year ago. $10,000. And I was planning to invest that money somewhere, but I didn't get an opportunity. And I had told you I will pay you back these $10,000 in a year. And now a year has passed, and that's 10,000 has stayed with me. So a year has passed on the nisab. Zakat would become obligatory on me, but there's a hindrance, and the hindrance is that I owe that $10,000 back to you. It's a debt on me to you. And so there is no obligation on me to give zakat. The obligation is for me to pay you back your debt. Okay? If I pay zakat from that amount, then that's going to diminish the wealth that I need to pay you back. It's a debt on me towards you. Okay? So that's another example of a hindrance. Paternity is a hindrance for the obligation of qisas. When somebody murders somebody else, there's an obligation of qisas in Islam. Qisas meaning that the family of the deceased have the right to demand capital punishment, death penalty. They have the right to demand that. However, when the murderer is the father and the one who has been murdered is the son, then qisas is not an option. The father will be punished in other ways, but not by the death penalty for killing his son. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said so. So in this case, paternity becomes a hindrance from the obligation of qisas. Okay, so these are examples of mani, hindrance. The lawgiver has attached this attribute to a hukum in this relationship. Whenever this attribute is there, then the hukum is not going to take place. Otherwise, it would have. Otherwise, you would have demanded the death penalty for the murderer. But in this case, this produces a hindrance. And that hindrance is attached by the lawgiver, not by me or you. All right. Validity and invalidity. Sihha and butlan. An action that is performed fulfilling all of its preconditions and integrals in the absence of any hindrances is called valid. When an action is valid, it is effective, it takes place, and is given legal consideration. Invalid, batil, is an action that is performed without some of its preconditions and integrals. Sorry, I should have used the word prerequisites just to be consistent. Okay, what I mean here is shart. Preconditions is just another word for prerequisites. Okay. An action that is performed without some of its prerequisites or integrals or in the presence of a hindrance. Of an action that is invalid, is ineffective, does not take place, and is not given any legal consideration. Examples of invalid actions. Prayer without wudu. Prayer without wudu is invalid. Why? Because it is performed without some of its preconditions. Wudu is a prerequisite for prayer. So it makes it invalid. And since prayer without wudu is invalid, it is ineffective, does not take place. So if in the middle of the prayer, I realize I don't have wudu, I don't break my prayer because there is no prayer. There is no prayer taking place. I'm just going through the motions. I'm not in prayer. Prayer cannot exist without its prerequisite. It is an invalid, batil action that has no existence in the eyes of the Shara. It's not given any legal consideration. Marriage without a mahram. Sorry, marriage with a mahram. Okay, a man gets married to a woman. A man gets married to a woman and then discovers that, oh, she's my mahram. Does he need to divorce her? No, there's no need for the marriage did not take place. It took place on paper, but in the eyes of the Shara, in the eyes of the lawgiver, that marriage did not take place. It has no existence, has no legal consideration. The sale of wine is an invalid trade transaction because it is haram li dhatihi to sell wine, because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited that and said Allah's curse is upon the one who does that. So it is an invalid transaction because it's haram li dhatihi, and we said haram li dhatihi are things that are invalid, right? So since it's invalid, that sale in the eyes of the Shara has no existence, and therefore I need to return the money back. It's not mine. I sold wine and got the money. That money is not mine. I need to give it back unless the buyer says, no, no, keep it. I give it to you as a gift. Okay, as a gift, you give it to me. But this is not a sale transaction because that sale does not take place in the eyes of Shara. It's an invalid transaction. So these are examples of invalid transactions. Now, there's something called fasid. What we talked about so far is batil. But then there's something called fasid. So is there a difference between butlan and fasad? Well, first of all, an invalid action is an action that is illegal in its essence, whereas an irregular action is an action that is in and of itself legal, but is associated with something external to it that makes it illegal. Sounds similar to haram li dhatihi and haram li ghayrihi. Okay? Examples. When an insane person conducts a commercial transaction, that commercial transaction is batil. Because in order for a trade transaction to happen, a commercial transaction to happen, both sides need to be mukallaf. Both sides need to be mukallaf. That is a condition for the validity of a sale transaction. It's a condition for the validity of a sale transaction. And so if one side is insane, that will make the transaction invalid, batil. Another example of an invalid transaction is to transact a commodity that does not exist. If I sell you something that does not exist, that's an invalid sale transaction. Okay, and we already talked about the sale of wine. To sell wine is also an invalid transaction. These are all examples of invalid transactions because they're illegal in their essence. Now, examples of irregular transactions. Number one, selling a house with the condition that the buyer cannot live in it. Selling a house with the condition that the buyer cannot live in it. This is a transaction that is in and of itself legal because I'm selling a house and I am a mukallaf and you are a mukallaf. So this is in and of itself a legal transaction. But this stipulation that I'm putting in the contract is making this transaction illegal. It has nothing to do with the transaction itself. It's an added stipulation, so it is external to it. that's making this transaction illegal. So we call it fasid. This is a fasid transaction. Another example is selling 1 dirham for 2 dirhams. In the old days, you know, they dealt with coins, silver coins and gold coins. So if I have a silver coin and you have silver coins, okay, but your silver coins are broken. You have broken pieces of silver. My silver coin is intact. It's a whole. The weight is the same. The weight is the same. But since your silver coin is broken, I demand from you that you give me 2 for 1. So I'm getting double the amount of silver from you just because they're broken. This is not allowed. This is not allowed. But this is not illegal essentially because trade of silver for silver is allowed. But what is making this illegal is the disparity in the quantity that you and I are trading. And it's unfair. Another example is making a vow to fast on the day of Eid. If I make a promise to Allah, say, Ya Allah, if you help me pass this exam or if you help me get this job, I will fast the day of Eid. Okay, now making a vow to fast is perfectly fine. But the fact that I'm making a vow to fast on the day of Eid, and it is forbidden to fast on Eid, that is making this vow illegal. And so this vow is fasid. Okay, so these are all examples of fasid. The sale of 1 dirham for 2 dirhams is fasid. The sale of a house with the condition that the buyer cannot live in it, it's fasid. And making a vow to fast the day of Eid is fasid. Now, what is the consequence of distinguishing a fasid act from a batil act? Because a fasid act can be fixed, whereas a batil act is completely void and has to be done all over again. It can be fixed. So if I sell you a house with the condition that you cannot live in it, all I have to do is remove that stipulation from the contract and the sale is valid. If I am selling you 1 dirham for 2 dirhams, right? You just take 1 dirham back and the sale is valid. If I'm making a vow to fast the day of Eid, I just change it to a different day and the vow becomes valid. But when you have a batil act, right? When you have a batil act, for example, an insane person conducted a commercial transaction, the commodities have to be given back and the transaction has to be done all over again. Can't be fixed. Okay, so a batil act has to be done all over again. A fasid act can be fixed. Okay, and therefore in Hajj, for example, in Hajj, if you don't stand in Arafah on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, your Hajj is batil. Your Hajj is batil. But if you, during Hajj, you are in Ihram and you put on perfume, your Hajj has become fasid. So when the Hajj is fasid, it can be fixed by doing what? By giving an atonement. All you do is pay dam and your Hajj is fixed. But when the Hajj is batil, I didn't stand in Arafat on the 9th of Dhul Hijjah, now I cannot fix it. I have to redo the whole Hajj next year. Okay, so that's the difference between batil and fasid. Then there's the concept of azima and rukhsa. Original law and concession. Azima is the general demand from the lawgiver. Rukhsa is modified law to provide ease for exceptional cases. Okay, so an example of azima is that it is unlawful to consume unslaughtered dead meat. That's azima. That's the general demand from the lawgiver. Unlawful to consume unslaughtered dead meat. But now concession is that law modified to provide ease for exceptional cases. So eating unslaughtered dead meat becomes wajib for the one that will otherwise die. Look, it goes from being haram to being wajib. Yeah? That's a concession. That's a rukhsa. Another example. It is yeah, actually I jumped ahead. What I was gonna say is that it is lawful. So concession is it is lawful to consume unslaughtered dead meat in the case of necessity. Now there's different types of concession. A concession can be wajib or mandub or mubah. So the case of eating unslaughtered meat for the one that will otherwise die, that I said is what? Is it wajib or mandub or mubah? It's wajib. An example of a concession that is recommended but not required according to non-Hanafis is shortening your prayer during a journey. Shortening your prayer during a journey is a rukhsa. It's a concession. That's not the original law. The original law is you're supposed to pray Dhuhr 4 rak'ah, Asr 4 rak'ah, Isha 4 rak'ah. But during a travel, there's a concession from the lawgiver, modifying the law to provide ease for you. Okay, instead of praying 4, you pray 2. That concession, is it required for you to pray 2? According to non-Hanafis, no. It is recommended that you pray 2. In other words, if you prayed 4, it would still count, according to non-Hanafis. But Hanafis say that this is a rukhsa that is wajib. So you have to shorten in the Hanafi school. Okay? An example of a rukhsa that is mubah is omitting a fast during travel when it does not present a hardship. Omitting a fast during travel when it does not pose a hardship. This is a rukhsa that is not required. Yani, it's okay for you to fast during travel. One time I was fasting while traveling, and one of my relatives said, you should break your fast, you're traveling. No, I don't have to break my fast when I'm traveling. It's permission from it is this is not the first type of rukhsa. This is the third. It's a permission from Allah Azza wa Jal. Now, if I'm experiencing hardship, then that's a different story. For me to fast while I'm traveling and I'm fainting from the hardship, no. Then in that case, it would be either mandub or required for me to break the fast. Okay? And there's a qaida here also that is related legal axiom that says al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. That difficulty draws ease. That in general, the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is designed in such a way that whenever we are faced with difficulties, the law is modified to make it easier. for me. In general, that's the case. Not always. Like I said, all these axioms have exceptions, but the general rule is difficulty draws ease. Okay, I'm traveling, it's difficult for me to fast. I can fast at a different time. I'm sick, it's difficult for me to stand up and pray. I can pray sitting down. Okay, I'm traveling, it's difficult for me to find water. I can make tayammum. Okay, I'm wearing foot gear. It's difficult for me to remove the foot gear to wash my feet. I can wipe over my foot gear. So difficulty draws ease. Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Allahu a'lam. We have a few minutes. We're going to go on to the second part of usul al-fiqh. So we're done with al-hukm al-shar'i. We're done with al-hukm al-taklifi and al-hukm al-wad'i. All right. Now we're going to talk about the sources of Islamic law. The sources of fiqh. What are the sources from which hukum is derived? Right? So when we say something is obligatory, what is the source that tells me that X is obligatory? Or when we say that something is a sabab for something else, what is the source that tells me that this is the sabab for this? Or when I say that something is a rukhsa, something is a concession, what is the source that tells me that this is a rukhsa? What are the sources of Islamic law? The sources of fiqh, the source of fiqh is something whose proper analysis helps the scholar to extract a legal ruling. The source doesn't always spell out for you the law. No, it has to be analyzed. The source has to be analyzed. It has to be interpreted most of the time, not all the time. Sometimes it is spelled out. But most of the time, it has to be derived from the source. And that's why there's an interpretive process that we will talk about tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala. So what are the sources of Islamic law? Well, first of all, what I want you to see here right before your eyes is that the sources of Islamic law are not confined to the Quran and Sunnah. Yes, it begins with Quran and Sunnah, but it's not confined to the Quran and Sunnah. The sources of Islamic law that are accepted by all Muslim scholars, Sunnis as well as non-Sunnis, by consensus, are Quran and Sunnah. Okay? The sources of Islamic law that are accepted by almost all Sunni scholars are ijma' and qiyas. Ijma' and qiyas are accepted sources of Islamic law by almost all Sunni scholars. And these four sources of fiqh are together called the primary sources of Islamic law. The primary, not the only. The primary sources of Islamic law: Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas. So if these are the primary sources of Islamic law, that means there must be secondary sources. And yes, and they are these. These are the secondary sources of Islamic law. And they are secondary because almost all of them are accepted by most scholars, but not all scholars. So some scholars have an issue with maslaha mursala, some have issue with urf, some have issue with shar'u man qablana, some have issue with qawl al-sahabi, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, the majority of Sunni Muslim scholars accept all of these as sources of fiqh. Okay, so together these 11, therefore, are the sources of Islamic law, and we're going to go through them one by one, inshallah ta'ala, for the remainder of today. One by one, inshallah. We're going to cover all of them. We're going to spend more time on the first four and less on the secondary sources. Okay. So let's start with the Quran. Now, some things were already covered in Quran 101 related to the Quran. So we're not going to go into all the details. But one thing that I want to remind you of is that the entire Quran is qat'i in its thubut. And most of it is dhanni in its dalala. We've talked about definitive and probabilistic earlier. We've talked about authenticity and meaning earlier. Okay, so the entire Quran is definitive in its authenticity, qat'i in its thubut. But not the entire Quran is qat'i in its dalala, in its meaning. In fact, most of it is dhanni in its dalala, meaning that it can be interpreted in different ways. And all you have to do is pick up a book of tafsir to see how true that is. Because in most of the ayat, you'll find Sahabi such and such said, this is what it means, and Sahabi such and such said, this is what it means. And there are variations of opinions about what ayat mean exactly. Okay, so that shows that most of the Quran is dhanni in its dalala. Now, part of what you were also supposed to learn in Quran 101 was that there are different qira'at of the Quran. And some of them are called mutawatir qira'at, and some of them are called shadh qira'at. And I was going to talk about this more, but I think I'm gonna, for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip some of this. And there are, I guess the one thing that I do want to talk about is there are mutawatir qira'at and shadh qira'at. So what is a shadh qira'ah? A shadh qira'ah is a way of reciting a certain ayah of the Quran that is transmitted by chains of transmission that are reliable. Reliable chains of transmission. But they are non-mutawatir chains, ahad chains. Okay, so that would make a qira'ah shadha, because for qira'ah to be mutawatira, it has to be transmitted through mutawatir chains. And when a qira'ah is mutawatira, right, and there are many mutawatir qira'at, when a qira'ah is mutawatira, that can be recited in salah. Okay, but when a qira'ah is not mutawatira, it cannot be recited in salah. Not be recited in salah. So when you have a qira'ah that is shadha, that's not mutawatira, but there's a reliable chain of transmission, that's not considered Quran, But is it considered a source of law? Can it be considered a source of law? Another type of, I'll answer this question in just a minute, but there's another type of qira'ah shadda as well. And that is when you have a qira'ah that does not conform to the script of Uthman. The Uthmani script is the script that we have in our Quran today. If there's a qira'ah that does not conform to that script, does not conform to that script, that's also called qira'ah shadda. Once again, if such a qira'ah is transmitted through a reliable chain of transmission, as long as it's not conforming to the Uthmanic script, it's not considered Quran, it's not going to be recited in Salah. But can we use it, or do we use it as a source of Islamic law? Okay, and I know I'm skipping a whole discussion here about, well, how do we even have such qira'ats? How can you have a reliable transmission of an ayah of the Quran that departs from the Uthmanic script, and yet it's a reliable chain of transmission? And that's a discussion that I have to skip, because that's a discussion for Quran 101. Well, how did these qira'at come into existence, and the ahruf and the qira'at and so on? Let's skip that discussion. But right now, just take it for what it is, that there are such qira'at, called qira'at shadda. So an example, we conclude with this, inshallah ta'ala. Surah Al-Ma'idah, Surah number 5, ayah number 89. Okay, I'm going to pull it up real quick on my mushaf here. So, and you can too if you want. Surah number 5, ayah number, what did I say? 89. Okay, Surah number 5, ayah number 89. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says what? He says, it's a long ayah. لا يؤاخذكم الله باللغو في أيمانكم ولكن يؤاخذكم بما عقدتم الأيمان فكفارته إطعام 10 مساكين من أوسط ما تطعمون أهليكم أو كسوتهم أو تحرير رقبة فمن لم يجد فصيام 3 أيام. I'm just going to stop right there. This ayah is talking about the issue that we talked about earlier, which is what to do when you break an oath, right? Remember, we said when you break an oath, what do you have to do? You have to do kafara. And you have a choice between how many different things? 3 things. And what if you can't do any of those 3 things? Then what do you have to do? Fast what? 3 days. What does the ayah say? فَصِيَامُ 3 أَيَّامٍ. You must fast 3 days. There is a qira'ah of this that is authentically transmitted from Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b, 2 giants among the Sahaba, for their knowledge of the Quran. Authentically transmitted to them, but ahad chains of transmission that say what? فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ فَصِيَامُ 3 أَيَّامٍ مُتَتَابِعَاتٍ. That you have to fast 3 consecutive days. The word consecutive is not there in your mushaf, but it was there in the mushaf of Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. That makes it a qira'ah shadha. We can't recite it in salah. Does not conform to the Uthmani manuscript or script. However, do we base law on that? In other words, since in their qira'ah, that condition is there, 3 consecutive days, are we going to say that the kafara is that you have to fast 3 consecutive days? Or can you put a gap between those 3 days? In other words, do we use a shadh qira'ah as a basis for Islamic law or not? Everybody agrees that we're not going to treat it as Quran. Okay, everybody agrees with that. But do we use it as a source for Islamic law? Some of the ulama said no, and some of them said yes. The Malikis and the Shafi'is said no. And it makes sense what they said, because what are we talking about? Look, Quran. And we just said it's not Quran. Quran is a source of law. That's not Quran. So how can you make it a source of law? But others, like the Hanafis and the Hanbalis, said, yes, we're going to treat it as a source of law. Even though it's not Quran, we're going to treat it as the Sunnah. Why? Because they say, look, Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay must have learned this from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Otherwise, they would not have put that in their mushaf. And maybe it's not supposed to be part of the Quran. Maybe it's their understanding of what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught, so they added it as tafsir in their mushaf. So it is coming from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, must be coming from him. So yes, it's not Quran, but it's Sunnah. And the sources of fiqh begin with Quran and Sunnah. So it is going to be treated as a source of Islamic law. And therefore, in the Hanbali and the Hanafi madhab, the atonement for breaking an oath is that you must fast 3 consecutive days. Whereas in the Shafi'i and Maliki schools, you can have a gap in between. So you see how usulul fiqh is playing an impact on fiqhi differences. This is an example of that. It's just a very small example of this. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So we are done with the Quran as a source of Islamic law. And the next is going to be the Sunnah. So we're going to stop here, inshallah ta'ala. We're going to take our lunch break, and then we're going to have Salatul Dhuhr after that. So lunch is already here. For those on Zoom, you're missing out. But Salatul Dhuhr is at 2:30. So inshallah, we plan to resume at 2:50 sharp, inshallah, at 2:50 sharp. And I will begin with addressing some of your questions that are there on the WhatsApp group, inshallah. So you can take this time also to post any questions that you have, and I'll go over them right after the lunch break. Jazakumullah khairan, subhanakallahumma bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.